in just a second with the intro. Before we do, I'm going to do something a little different. I don't usually do this right out the gate. I want everybody to go down in the description, join MythVision. If you haven't already signed up, Dr. Bart Ehrman is going to be having an online webinar. I'll be there present November 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Go sign up through the link in the description, and that's Team MythVision. Yes, there are other YouTubers there. There'll be Aaron Raw, Holy Kool-Aid, other people that will be joining. But if you're MythVision fans and stuff, we're kind of in a little competition here. So go sign up. Also, Dr. Steve Mason's got plenty of works on Amazon. I've got a few behind me on the shelf. I highly recommend you read this material to at least catch up on Josephus scholarship and understand what the Josephus scholars are saying. If you have a different opinion at the end of the day, that's perfectly fine. But I always recommend understanding what scholarship is saying in a field before you draw your own conclusions. And last of all, we have the Patreon. You want to help us out? Check it out. Join it. We're going to be diving deep today into Josephus, how he may be used by the author of Luke, Acts. And there's proof. There's good, significant, I think, proof to see some type of intertextuality taking place. This will affect the dating of these texts. So a lot of people want to make Paul a companion of, or Luke a companion of Paul. And if Paul's running around in, let's say the 40s and the 50s, and then boom, he's no more, we have to assume this author is writing this stuff much later, in my opinion, after Josephus's literature. So this is going to be an interesting discussion today. You want to stay tuned. With that being said, Dr. Steve Mason, thank you for joining me again at MythVision. It's really, I'm glad to see you back here. It's been a while.
Yeah. Hey, me too. It's really a pleasure. Thank you.
I always enjoy our shows. Always. I don't care if they're 8 hours long. I mean, seriously. Seriously, no, every time it's extremely thought-provoking. Every person who I've been encountering in the comment sections, and then people I know on Facebook, they go, man, they highly recommend all the videos we do. And they know that you're going to do a thorough analysis, breaking down why you're thinking the way that you do. So to kiss your butt up front, we want to say you're a wonderful teacher. Hey. And we mean that. We mean that because you're taking your time. You don't come across as a know-it-all, but you do know very many valuable methodology, if you will. The methodology you're using is very valuable. And the way that you're coming across is you have a lot of insight. So I think all of us can learn a thing or two. And so with that being said, I'm all at your mercy. Tell us what's going to happen today.
Hey, thank you very much, Derek. It's really great to be back with you. It's been a while, man. It's been a few months, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my screen here and get us rolling. The question is, now let's just see if I can go to full screen.
You're there.
Okay.
And I just want our audience to know so that people will pop in. Do me a favor when new people pop in the chat, because people are going to trickle in and they're not going to know what I said early on. So please, I'm asking MythVision fans who are watching right now, inform people as we go that Dr. Steve Mason he wants this to be interactive. He doesn't just want to be a monologue show. He loves seeing the audiences, poking in. And if you want to ask a question, you want to interrupt in a way, and it's not really interrupting, it's relevant to the topic. Try and keep it topic related. Super chat your question. This is a way we keep the lights on at MythVision. I understand not everybody can super chat. I get it. But if you want to ask a question in the middle of this presentation, I'll be happy to try and ask Dr. Mason. We want to make this as interactive as possible, like I said. So anyone who comes along, inform people that. And so take us into this, Dr. Mason. I'm looking forward to hearing what you say.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. Indeed, I want to actually ask the audience a couple of questions, and we'll see if anybody answers. So the big question for this presentation is a question. If anyone saw my very long thing on the historian's workshop, you remember that history is an investigation. It's always an investigation of something. You set a problem for yourself. You say, okay, what's the evidence? You weigh the evidence, you try to understand it, then you try to explain it. And you say, what's the best hypothesis to the most economical one, the one that best explains everything that we have. But that doesn't mean we know. what happened. New evidence will change our minds. But for now, we do what we can. So the question is, was Josephus a source for Luke Acts? And here I need to take about 2 minutes just to recall some basic methodological, pointers. Otherwise, if you're looking for me to say, yes, I have definitive proof, this is a knockout proof, I don't have that. It's all in history a matter, especially ancient history, a matter of, trying to weigh what's the best explanation. So the issue is that we have several striking overlaps between only Josephus and Luke Acts in all ancient literature, right? So some of you will know these, the rebels named Judas and Theudas, a guy called the Egyptian, a very interesting name, Sicarii, who are they, this Latin term. And these texts both mention these things. So when you have two texts, if you're a teacher or a professor or you work in other fields and you see two texts with striking similarities, you have three basic explanations. And each of these can be refined, but essentially, if you think this is formulated in a way that can't be coincidental, we'll come back to that in a second, then you have three basic explanations. Either Josephus was a source for Luke, or Luke was a source for Josephus, or they somehow shared either the same source or they collaborated or something like that. So the main view in scholarship, the main view among academics so far, the main one, has been that they use a common source. So the third option there. Why? Because of the differences between the way Josephus uses Judas, Theudas, the Egyptian, the Sicarii, the way that he explains them, and the way that Luke Acts clumps them together differently. In fact, incompatibly with Josephus. The names are the same. Some of the details are the same, but the chronology is different. The relationships are different. So people ask themselves, well, wait a minute, if you have a good source and you're borrowing from it, why wouldn't you follow the source, right? So they say, no, he can't have used Josephus. He must have used Luke Acts, the author must have used a different kind of source that was also available to Josephus.
May I ask a quick
thing in this? Go ahead,
because you bring mainstream scholars are saying that they think a common source is being used, but I'm probably, this is probably not fair, but it is a reasonable question to ask. Are most mainstream scholars Christian? Because if they are, and their dating is trying to preserve an early date to the Gospels, I could get why they would go, well, let's make sure Luke is not late in the game because we want our orthodox position and our idea that Luke was a companion of Paul. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it just, I get that they would argue the differences make it sound like they're getting it from two different, or from a similar common source. But to me, you could do this. It's just as plausible to say that they're using actual Josephus. That he's just doing his own thing with the content, if that makes sense.
And that's actually where I'm going to go with this thing.
Oh, okay. But sorry, I'm jumping the horse. Then,
but no. I'm glad you asked, because for one thing, I want to push back a little bit, Derek, and say I think that it's not so useful, at least for a historian, to ask, who's a Christian, who isn't a Christian. I understand why you're doing it, and with many of the people viewing, you think of Christian in a particular way, right? Evangelical, conservative Christian, but Christianity is such a broad, literal church. I mean, Catholics of all descriptions, Orthodox, liberal, Protestants, many people are Christians who are quite happy with any dating that you come up with. And, they don't hold to that kind of inerrancy of the Bible in the way the Protestant tradition does, or some of the Protestant tradition. So mainstream scholars, I just mean that this is mostly what people wrote. It has changed in the past 25 years, 30 years. And you talked about how humble I was before, something like that. I have to be a little bit conceited here and say I have a role in that because of I argued back in a 1992 book for what I'm presenting here today.
Oh, wow.
And so it has had an impact. That's the book Josephus and the New Testament. In the 6th chapter of that book, I argue for a connection between Josephus and Luke Acts, and that had some traction with Acts scholars like Richard Purvo, especially, who really made it popular in that field.
Right.
But
he's a big Acts guy for anybody.
Yeah. He credited me fully in his work, and I'm not suggesting he stole from me or anything like that. I'm just saying it has. So what's mainstream, I don't know. I haven't taken a poll recently, but I just mean this was the prevailing view when I first suggested a different way of looking at it. Because here's the methodological issue. That when you say that, hey, they went back to a common source, you can only do that if you overlook the difference between events and the way they're represented in a writing. Okay, so you have events on the one hand, like the chaos of events around us that happen, and then the way somebody presents them in writing. These are two different things. And if you squash those two things together, then you say, well, the events happened. There was a guy named Judas, a guy named Theudas. I mean, who wouldn't know that? And then everybody's just drawing from the same pool of information. But what I'm going to suggest is that, in fact, no independent authors would choose the same events, the same individuals, and characterize them in much the same language. That can't happen, not on a consistent basis. So the issue then is, why does Luke Acts reflect the choices and the characterizations, which I'll illustrate, of Josephus?
Interesting.
And if he does, then I think by far the most probable explanation is that he borrowed from Josephus. Here I'm going to make three quick assumptions. They're not assumptions for me. I'm happy to argue them at considerable length, but I don't have time here today to get into them. So I'm just letting the viewers know these are the things I'm assuming today for the purposes of this presentation. Okay, so you might, if a very alert viewer will say, wait a minute, you're assuming this. So let me just lay it on the table, what I'm assuming. First of all, that in ancient rhetorical training, and rhetorical training was the basis of ancient education, right? That's what all young people who got any education, that's what they studied, rhetoric. And the whole point of that was that you take a source and you change it. You use it in new ways. And you can even take a famous source, like something from Homer, or something from tragedy, or something from Plato, and then you reconfigure it to do what you're doing, right? So that means that when you see differences, that's not really an argument against the use of sources, because straight out copying a source would be considered lame, right? That's just lazy. You're not doing your job. Your job is to take something famous like from Homer and to give it a new twist and put it in a new situation that's not related to what Homer did with it.
This actually taps into what Dennis McDonald and Richard Carrier were saying when I was in California. He said that when they taught historians how to write literature, oftentimes it wasn't purely what we think of history, like everything is factual, right? It has to be purely to the bone. Sometimes you want to add like something that's going to entertain, which is part of being a great writer. But at the same time, you're right. There was they would teach you how to rework material to your own agenda. And this is something that was common knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, they drilled you in it. We still have some of the handbooks where they taught students how to do this. And there were all kinds of ways to do it, like rephrase it, make the opposite argument from the same evidence, all that kind of stuff. It's really pretty heavy duty. I think it would be very demanding to be in school in the ancient world, because you had to be on your toes, to pull this off. Second thing, Josephus, as soon as his writings were finished, he quickly became the authoritative source for Judean, realities in Rome. He's living and writing in Rome, and as soon as he finishes his War and his Antiquities, his two major works, they become quickly, people say, okay, he's the go-to guy. We know that from, for example, Tacitus' histories. It's a bit debated, but I agree with those who think that Tacitus, there are striking parallels between Tacitus and Josephus on the Jewish war. So I think it's clear he's writing a generation later. he knew the work of Josephus, who was also in Rome. In the 2nd century, this guy, Aelius Herodian, he quotes Josephus everywhere whenever he's referring to, southern Syria. He says, Josephus tells us this. So it's clear. And then Christian authors at the same time begin to take him up in a very obvious way, naming him as their source. So that's the second thing that you need to know, that Josephus was kind of the man, right, for Judean affairs. And then the big point here is to come back to what I already said, that events are not the same as the way they're represented. And we often forget this, right? Because we watch the news and we say, well, they're just telling us what happened. Like there was a bomb, there was an explosion, there was a murder or something. But the way you frame it, of course, is going to be individual with each reporter. Events themselves don't come with their own language. They're not self-interpreting. They don't declare their own meaning. Somebody has to, explain why they're significant. And independent authors, any two independent writers, will not agree. So to put it visually, I've already used this illustration in a previous talk, but I really like it, so bear with me. I think this is kind of what life is like, this chaos of events. And if you want to say something about this, you have to make a story from it. And what you do to do that is you pick out the events you're going to include, the individuals you're going to name, the motives you're going to attribute to them, and you make a story arc out of this, right? But that's not given by the events, right? It's something that you do. It's from the events. It's not made up, but you're the one who chooses how to put them all together. That's why there are endless books on the Second World War still coming out, in 2021, because new writers are putting all the pieces together differently. So let me give you an example. Do you play an instrument, Derek?
I don't. I've tried to get started, but it's a lot of time, and I was older when I began to try and do it. So,
okay, what did you try?
I was trying to acoustic guitar.
Yeah, cool. That's a good thing to do. I mean, you can do a lot with a guitar. I amuse myself by playing saxophone. I don't amuse anybody else by doing it, but I amuse myself greatly, and it's a nice kind of breathing exercise, if nothing else. Anyhow, so if you just think, here's an analogy of what I'm trying to say. Here's the range of the tenor sax is like only 33 notes, right, from low B flat to F sharp, and so 33 notes. Yeah, and virtually all songs that you hear on the radio or whatever. People don't listen to the radio anymore. Wherever you hear them, your illegal downloads. That they only have usually within half of that range. Virtually all songs, right? And yet, if you go pick up Spotify or Apple Music or something, you find they claim to have more than 70 million songs, right? So think about that for a moment. Tens of millions of songs, just those that they have been made from these few notes, right? So here's my interactive bit here. If the audience can hear this, I'm not sure if it'll work. See, if I'm just going to play like a couple of bars, and you tell me if anybody wants to text in, what is the song? Okay, that's one. I'll go ahead with the others while people are texting.
Okay.
Okay, third one. And a fourth one. Okay. Well, right off the bat, Derek, do you recognize any of those? All of them?
I can answer it, but I want my audience to play the game.
Okay.
So we have Amazing Grace. Smoke says Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace.
Yeah. So the first one's clear. Amazing Grace.
All right. So Auld Lang Syne.
Auld Lang Syne. No.
Okay. Pink Panther.
Yeah, Pink Panther was the second one. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Grace, Panther, old one.
Probably the Panther anyway. Yeah, that's Pink Panther, the old one. Yeah.
Okay. Bridge on the River.
Yeah, Bridge on the River Kwai, Colonel Bogey March. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. Let me see. Yep, Pink Panther again.
The fourth one was the toughest one. The fourth one was the hardest one.
Smoke on the Water.
No.
No.
No, I can see the connection, but it's not that. Yeah.
Dead ant, dead ant.
Did anybody get? Do you see anybody get Elton John? Don't let the sun go down on me.
No,
Okay,
nothing.
that's the fourth one. It's the first. It's just the first bar.
Okay.
But the point is, my point is, you can see that just with a few notes, like even like a B A B in the case of Don't Let Sun Go Down, it's just like a minor variation. Even just holding the same note with a little bit of a timing difference, put in a rest here or there, and with those few notes, you can make tens of millions of songs, right? And it's so clear, the distinctiveness, that your audience picked them out, right? Just from one or two bars. And this is like famous radio show stuff, right? They do radio shows with this. Can you name that tune with a bar or two in a quiz? And the point is, they're so clear that you can get sued for if you present this as your own work, right? And I guess we call it sampling, right? When you take someone else's little bit of a tune and you stick it in your own music, if it's not somehow acknowledged, you can be in big trouble. I remember there was a debate or fuss about the Procol Harum song, A Whiter Shade of Pale. So it's the same, like, because there's a beautiful organ introduction there. I remember there was some kind of debate about that, who wrote it, and it's just very short, but it's a nice little bit of music. But the point is that the creativity of an author, right, it lies even just in 3 or 4 notes, putting them together in a certain way, and therefore no two people are. I mean, it's extremely unlikely that any two people, even with just 33 notes to play with, are going to come up with the same notes and the same arrangement, the same timing, and so on, right? And then with the lyrics of a song. Now, if you're dealing with a cliche, like in English, if somebody says, as a matter of fact, or on the one hand, or on the other hand, well, these are not telltale signs of copying, right? Because they're cliches. They're just what we always say all the time. But if somebody says to you, I was walking down the street, I was thinking as the miller told his tale, and their face at first just ghostly turned a whiter shade of pale. This kind of language, immediately, is not. It's from somewhere, right? It's from the Procol Harum song.
It's not, fair example in Acts. It's hard to kick against the goads. This is clearly a Euripides lift. It sounds like that's not just a cliche.
Yeah, exactly. You got it spot on. So if you see, I mean, it's the same principle we use to detect plagiarism, right? It's pretty easy to detect if you've been grading papers and then you pick up another one and you say, wait a minute, that sounds awfully much like one I already graded. And you go back and you see there is a few words in common, or even the way that they laid it out, in a very close way. They might have deliberately changed it, might have been working together, and two students deliberately changed the wording. Right. But you can see the connection, because two independent writers would not do the same thing. So let me illustrate this just with a quick web search. If you pop in Plato into Google or whatever your favorite search engine is, you will find that because so many people are writing about Plato, just look down these different, the first few lines of the introduction, they're completely independent. They say very similar things. There's only so much you can say about Plato. He's a famous philosopher and all that. But still, look at the language. Plato's one of the world's best known, most widely read, studied philosophers. He was a student of Socrates. Okay, next one. Plato's one of the most important. He founded the academy in Athens. His works on philosophy, politics, mathematics. So, and then the third one decides to stick in his Greek name. He was immensely influential. So they're similar, right, in what they're saying, but they are completely independent, because there's no, you can see that independent people would come up with such things. But if you compare that with a far less known writer, like that guy I mentioned before who uses Josephus a lot, this Greek-Roman writer, now Roman named writer, Aelius Herodian, in the 2nd century. Look at the descriptions here. So the first one, he was, or Herodian, flourished 2nd century, was one of the most celebrated grammarians. Okay, then there's one that's a little different, another one a little different, and then fourth one down.
He's one of the most celebrated grammarians. Yeah.
Exactly like the first one. And then the last one, it's exactly the same again. So these ones here are, identical. And it's not a matter of debate, right? It's just, for sure that one is copying the other. It's not possible for them to be independent. It's possible in some theoretical sense, but not in real life. Like 2 independent authors would not write the same words in the same order.
And just to point out, I suspect if we click the links, we'll find many differences, but enough to know that they're borrowing. So it's okay that there's differences. Differences doesn't prove they're not intertextual.
Yeah, and I should add, I'm not here, I have to make very clear, I'm not accusing anybody here of plagiarism. These are all, if you notice, they're all versions of Wikipedia. So there's DBpedia, there's Wiki thingy. So they are all consciously using the same material. I simply want to point out that if you didn't know that, you would already know that they are using the same material.
Right.
Okay. So they're not independent. And that's just easy to see. And that's the underlying principle of what I'm doing here. So I wanted to make this very clear. When we don't have the events anymore from the ancient world, but we read Josephus' narrative. It has a narrative arc, a shape to it, choices he made, individuals he chose to talk about. And then we read Luke Acts and we see, how about that? There are all these striking agreements. And we know that Josephus' account is highly selective because he says there are all these people, and I just want to tell you about this one here. Well, how is it that Luke Acts ends up with largely the same people, and has the same outlook on them, the same kind of characterization of them? And I'll explain what I mean about that. So the question is, do they fit in one narrative better than in the other? And my proposition is, let's look at 5 examples that really fit in Josephus and reflect his style and his choices and his interests and his narrative structure. And then they appear kind of randomly in Luke Acts. So how did they get there? Now, before we go on, one other thing to say, and I'll make this quick, is there are all kinds of other interesting parallels between Josephus and Luke Acts, which I think are much strengthened. They are made much more intelligible by the proposition that the author of Luke Acts knew Josephus' works. For example, both authors have a similar outlook. They both know classical literature. You just cited Euripides in Acts. He knows classical literature just like Josephus does, but both of them are on the margins of Greco-Roman society, and they want to play down. They don't brag about knowing classical literature the way some other authors do. They show off. These guys don't. These 2 authors, a Jew and a Christian, are both kind of on the edges, and they're both trying to say, they're both steeped in the Bible, and they're both centering their works in Jerusalem, not in Athens or Rome or somewhere like that. Both are writing kind of as historians, but each of them claims they've got a better sort of knowledge than history can give you. In Josephus' case, it's Moses. In the Christian case, it's Luke Acts, it's Jesus, of course. And both of them are citing prophets as the really authentic, true way to know the truth, which is not part of Greco-Roman culture. So they're both sitting on the edges like that. They're both doing a similar kind of thing. They're both highly suspicious of Greek rhetoric. Acts trims down speeches to very short paragraphs usually, or 2 or 3 paragraphs, unlike the great, show-off speeches of Thucydides or Josephus even. But Josephus is also very skeptical of Greek rhetoric. And here I want to give a quick 3 examples of, if you did posit that Acts knew the work of Josephus, the author of Acts, certain things would make better sense. So, for example, just 3 examples of this. In Acts 12, King Agrippa is said to put on a robe, and then he goes out in the theater in Tyre and Sidon somewhere near Lebanon, and people worship him as a god, and he's struck dead. Why did they think he was a god? It's never explained. Josephus says that he wore a cloak woven in silver thread that was amazing. I'll show you that in the next slide a little more clearly. And it caught the sun's rays. He did it at sunrise. And the sun, therefore, illuminated him. And that's why people said, wow, yeah, he looks like a god. Well, it's interesting that Acts doesn't explain any of that. Doesn't talk about the silver or the sunrise or the anything. But he does say he put on his robe and then was worshipped. Well, if you know Josephus' story, the Acts story makes a lot more sense, right? Even though Acts doesn't explain it. Second example, Paul meets with the governor Felix, and Acts says he just says casually, he was with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jew or Judean. No explanation beyond that. And then Paul lectures Felix on self-control and coming judgment. Why does he do that? And then the text says in Acts 24, Felix is terrified and sends him away. Why would Paul lecture him in this way? Well, in Josephus' account, Felix stole Drusilla from her husband, King Exegesis, who had undergone circumcision in order to become a Jew, in order to marry her. And then Felix came to town as governor. He saw her and thought she was very hot and stole her from the poor guy who had undergone circumcision in order to become a Jew. So now, if you know that backstory, it makes really a lot of sense that Paul would lecture Felix on self-control and coming judgment, and that Felix would be terrified and send him away, right? But
I just want to say one thing, though. My friend, I have tried to have Dr. Mason come on. For months now, I've been in contact with him. He's had a lot of work to do. I just want everyone to know, they've been like, well, bring him on more, because they love what you're saying. They love the stuff. I love it every time too. But I have tried, and trust me, Steve would love to come on more, but he also had 3-4 different like presentations around the world that you were like doing.
Yeah. In the past 2 or 3 weeks, I've had one was in Krakow, Poland, and one was in Amsterdam, and there are a couple more coming up. But before that, also there have been several. Yeah. So I really do love to do this. It's a gas. I enjoy it.
I love having you on. So anytime you have a window, you have plenty of insight. Trust me. If I got to read every little nook and cranny of your book and come up with a topic, I will, because you have tons of insight. So trust me, I try my damnedest to get these scholars on, and especially you, Dr. Mason. I love learning from you. So please, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. That's a nice way to interrupt. Thank you. I'm most grateful for that. So the third one is a related one. In Acts 25, the author just says that Agrippa II, so the son of Agrippa I, and Berenike, or Bernice, came into the court in Caesarea, and they came in great pomp and circumstance. And then Paul says, he's really flattering the king, and he says, "Oh, I'm so honored to be before you, because you really know Jewish law and custom." And if you just read that, you would assume that Berenike was the wife of Agrippa, right? I mean, they appear as a couple, as husband and wife. But if you know Josephus, you know they're in fact, she is Agrippa's sister, and they are rumored to be a couple, in spite of being violating Jewish law. In fact, in a rather big way, sleeping together. He remains a bachelor. She, in order to scotch the rumor that she's sleeping with her brother, goes and marries another king, local king from nearby named Polemo, and he undergoes circumcision. to marry her, but then she gets fed up with him because it was just like a sham marriage in order to cover up her relationship with her brother. So here you are reading Acts. You don't know that from the story, but if the author knew that, then he's having quite a good time, writing this stuff. As also with Felix and Drusilla, like, there's a lot of stuff going on in the background that he doesn't want to tell. Maybe because it's unseemly and it would detract from the point he's trying to make. But he could be having quite a good laugh writing all this stuff, which you would only know from Josephus' account.
Mm.
You get me?
This begs so many questions, by the way. So we'll get to Q&A later, and all that kind of stuff. But this just makes me have many questions about the narrative. But please continue.
Okay, but these are not decisive. All right, these are I'm the first to admit. So you got two authors doing similar things, similarly positioned culturally. Yeah, stories intersect, but they're not very, they're not really compelling arguments. But just before I go on, let me show you in a little bit more detail that robe issue. So here's the passage in Acts, right? Agrippa was angry with the Tyrians, Sidonians, so they came and begged him to meet, and he put on his royal robes. That's it. That's all the author says. Now look at Josephus' account. He put on a robe made entirely of silver with an amazing texture and entered the theater at the beginning of the day. At that time, in the sun's first rays, because he's in Caesarea, so he is on the west side with his back to the Mediterranean. Sun rises in the east over the theater, shines on him, right? So there's the theater, and there's looking out to sea, and there's Agrippa right there. And he's illuminated by the morning sun, and that's why they worship him in Josephus. So that's the kind of thing I'm getting at. If you know that, if the author knew that, makes the story much richer, even though he doesn't explain it.
Wow.
Anyhow, these are not decisive. So the 5 things I want to go through now, and I need you really I need the people who are watching to join me in this kind of thought experiment now. Okay, you're really joining me in the work I love to do in my workshop. And we're just going to look at the evidence and say, how do you make sense of this? So the first big issue is a complex of events that happened in the year 6 CE. They are altogether the annexation of Judea to Syria, a property registration or census, but a census devoted to recording property in 6 CE when Judea was joined to Syria, led by the Syrian governor Quirinius, which spawned a rebellion led by a guy named Judas. So there's a whole complex of events here that we need to figure out. Now, in Luke, Matthew knows nothing of this. He mentions nothing about his birth narrative, says nothing about any of this, right? In Matthew's version, Jesus' family is from Bethlehem, but because of the massacre of the innocents under King Herod, who dies in 4 BCE, right? The family has to flee to Egypt, and they're told to flee to Egypt by heavenly messenger. And then when Herod has died, they're going to go back home to Bethlehem, but an angel warns them, don't go to Bethlehem because his son Archelaus is now from 4 BC to 6 CE is ruling there. He's as bad as his father, so you don't want to go there. Go and settle in Nazareth in Galilee in the north. All right, so that's Matthew. Matthew knows nothing about any kind of census or what Luke talks about. But Luke says, Luke's explanation of how Jesus came to be born in Bethlehem, even though his family was known as Jesus of Nazareth. So Matthew's explanation is the reverse, right? He was from Bethlehem, went and settled in Nazareth. Luke's explanation is his family's from Nazareth. But in those days, a decree went out from the Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Everybody went to their towns to be registered. And then he goes on to say, well, Joseph, Jesus' notional father, went from Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem because he was descended from King David 1,000 years earlier, and therefore went to the hometown of David. this is highly problematic in historical terms. I mean, most of you watching have probably thought about this before, but it's very difficult. If you're taxing people for their property, you want to register their property, you don't send everybody in the world on a quest to find out, to go back to a place where their ancestors lived 1,000 years earlier. First of all, because that's not where your property is. Second of all, because many of those places won't exist anymore. Third, most people don't know who their ancestors were. I mean, we don't know. None of us knows. Even with Ancestry.com, we don't know who our ancestors were 1,000 years ago.
Right.
So it's just highly complex and weird. I mean, to have everybody in the world go, and there's no record of it anywhere. It just doesn't make any sense. Anyhow, the point is, that's what Luke says. That's the way he configures it around a census that he knows took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and he calls it by the Greek word apographe, which is an interesting word. It's not very common. It's only used by 4 or 5 Greek authors, orators, who use it in various contexts, but it's not commonly used except in Josephus and Lucas. So it's used about 60 odd times before Josephus and Lucas, but it's clustered in 4 or 5 authors. It's not a common Greek word. Then in the book of Acts, right, this famous scene where the early Christians are being prosecuted by the Sadducees, and I'll come back to that point as the last point today. A Pharisee, a brave Pharisee, who's a leading Pharisee named Gamaliel, stood up in the council and said, "Hey, stop it! Stop persecuting these guys. Listen, don't do what you're thinking of doing to these men. Imprison them, kill them. Don't do that. They already killed Jesus, but don't hassle these guys, because some time ago Theudas rose up claiming to be somebody. He was killed. Everybody who followed him. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up at the time of the census." Now, because Luke Acts is a 2-volume work, the reader should know the census. That's the time when Jesus was born, according to Luke chapter 2. So this author has a kind of big investment, a double investment in the census under Quirinius, with a rebellion by a guy named Judas the Galilean. And he calls this census because it's not a personal census counting heads. Like, it's not to determine who's a Roman citizen, which is a different kind of census, like where are all the Roman citizens living. It's a property registration. And so the Greek word is apographe for that. So this author has a big investment, a double investment in Luke and in Acts in this. So now we need to step back and think of what's happening here in Judea in 6 CE. Indeed, 6 was a pivotal date for the actual political life here. So this is when Herod's son Archelaus was banished by the Emperor Augustus for being a screw-up. He received big complaints from both Judeans and Samaritans, who didn't like each other, but they both agreed this guy was useless and dangerous and harmful. Can we please get rid of him? So at that point, the Emperor Augustus says, okay, I'm going to annex Judea back to where it had been before, the province of Syria. And Syria now takes up the entire east coast of the Mediterranean. And he sends the ex-consul, a very high-ranking senator, Sulpicius Quirinius, out there. And he has to now take a property census for everybody in this province, which now includes Judea. But it's possible to talk about what happened at the time without many of those elements, or just to mention one, depending on the author's aims. This comes back to my first methodological point, right? Each author will, according to what he or she is trying to do, will configure things differently. So you could just choose 1 or 2 of those things, or you could skip over them entirely like Matthew does. Josephus himself, when he writes his main first account of this in his Jewish War, book 2, he just says Judea became a province. He doesn't even mention Quirinius. He mentions the junior governor, the equestrian governor named Coponius. And he said the only figure he draws out is this Judas, the Galilean. and he calls him a sophist who began his own philosophical school. And he rejected direct Roman rule. And then he contrasts him with the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, who he says are the three proper schools we have of philosophy. I'll come back to that issue as well. But that's all he says. He mentions nothing here about property registration, nothing about being annexed to Syria, nothing about Quirinius, right? So my point is, given he knows about this stuff, right? He knows about it. It's not false, but it's misleadingly narrow in its focus. We know he knows about it because later in the war, he will incidentally mention Quirinius and the census at the very end of the war as a flashback. So we know that he knows about it, but when he's describing it, the events of 6 CE, early on in his narrative, he doesn't bother with it. So my point is that just because the events happen, right, every author is still going to choose what he wants to include, or she, and how, what language to use. And there are different words for census, by the way. You can just use the Latin word and put it in Greek, census. You can call it an apotime or some other kind of word. But this apographe is interesting. So he spotlights Judas there because when he's writing the war, he wants to make this guy the patriarch of all rebels against Rome. So he will later say that a guy at the time of the war against Rome named Menachem was a relative of this Judas. And then another guy, Eleazar, famously of Masada, Eleazar ben Yair, he says he was a relative of this Judas. So he's making Judas into like the patriarch of all the main rebel figures. And that's why he spotlights Judas. But at that point, he has no interest in telling you about all the other stuff, right? So it's only in his later work, the Antiquities, 17 to 18, that he gives you the full story in his language, his characterization, the annexation to Syria, property registration, Governor Quirinius, and he says Judas wasn't alone. He also had a partner named Zadok, who was a Pharisee. So the point is, he chooses how to populate each of his accounts, right? As any author does. Very quickly to mention, we actually happen to have an inscription that refers to, it's from a soldier, very accomplished soldier, who was working under Quirinius. And in the highlighted bit there, he makes reference to the census where he was told to go to the city of Apamea in Syria and count the citizens there of the city. So that's at least part of the same kind of big registration, for what it's worth. I thought people might be interested in that. So here's a visual representation of what's going on. Here's the province of Syria. It's the entire east coast of the Mediterranean, right, in Roman times. Now, the way they governed it was they sent a governor named the legate or legatus with 4 legions based in the north along the Euphrates River mainly to protect, because that's the edge of the Roman Empire.
Right.
To the east are the Parthians, right? So the Romans have to have a strong presence there, especially around the Euphrates. That's where they're most vulnerable. So what they did, however, in the south was they found a very reliable ally and powerful guy in King Herod. And they said, the ideal situation is let him take care of the south, because it's really far from where our legions are. And anyway, we're not that bothered about it. So he and his sons and grandsons can take care of that. But what happens, therefore, when Archelaus proves a dud and has to be removed, very reluctantly, Augustus takes him from the Eastern Empire and takes him all the way to the far west in Gaul, because he's just a total screw-up. He says, okay, we're going to do this. I'm going to put my own men in Caesarea on the coast. And these are the guys like Pontius Pilate will be one of this type of guy, an equestrian governor who answers to the big governor in the north, but he's like taking care of Judean matters in the south, right? So that's the new arrangement. And that's why you need a census for the whole province of Syria now together, right? So the events of 6. Did Luke simply relate independently what he knew had happened? So that's one possible hypothesis. Well, no, because Matthew has an entirely different account of Jesus' birth. Even the time is different. Before Herod dies in 4 BCE, the census in 6 CE. So he's not just taking common knowledge. The date doesn't work. Anyway, this idea of a worldwide census doesn't work. Augustus did take a census of the Roman citizens throughout the whole empire, but they didn't have to travel anywhere to do that. The question is just, are you a Roman citizen or not? So this idea, as we said before, of traveling to your ancient homeland doesn't make any sense. Your property registration has to be where the property is. Josephus, as we've already seen, tells the story of 6 CE very differently in war. He doesn't put in all that stuff. So the events themselves did not persuade Luke to just report what happened. He's getting this information from somewhere. And he treats Judas in the speech of Gamaliel in Acts 5. Judas is just a troublemaker, right? Like Theudas. They don't have any human, it's like they get up in the morning saying, what havoc can I wreak in the world today? I'm a bad dude, right? I just want to create trouble. Somebody show me where I can create trouble. That's how Gamaliel presents him. That reflects Josephus's view, but it's not a real view of a human being, right? That's, some people evidently viewed them as heroes. So this is a particular slant, and the slant that it is Josephus's slant. He doesn't need to explain who they are, and he uses this language of the apographe, and he makes the census out to be and the annexation out to be a very big event in the life of Judea. So the simplest explanation of this is that Luke Acts is recalling Josephus's configuration of events in Antiquities 17 to 18. Why? Because the author, Luke Acts, like Josephus, wants to show that he knows. He's an expert. He knows names. He knows events. He knows big stuff. That's what every ancient author wanted to do. And so he gets this stuff from Josephus and mashes it up a little bit. Let me go on to the next one, because I think it will explain. I mean, none of this is decisive, right? I come back to this point. This is not ironclad proof. I'm not claiming it is. I'm saying that if you try to explain this evidence, what's the best explanation? It can't be that Luke is using just facts. All right, that doesn't work as an explanation. And if he's using a source, that source looks very much like Josephus. So why wouldn't you say it's actually Josephus?
So if I may, just to get a super chat, someone had a good question about the last thing we had, and I do appreciate it. DJ Frank, he says, perhaps Dr. Mason will get to this, but didn't Luke mix up the chronological order of Judas' status and the Egyptian?
He did, evidently. And the best explanation of that is that he's using Josephus, right? So indeed, I'm coming to that. I think that's my third or fourth item here. I can't remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we are getting ahead of ourselves. Okay. Thank you for the super chat.
No,
really
that's great. I'm glad you asked, because you're thinking with me. Exactly. That's coming.
Cool.
But just before we get there, there's an even more curious thing in Luke 3, 1 and 2. Okay. So this is about the author tells you that one of the people ruling at the time when Jesus became visible, when he's baptized by John and so on, was somebody named Lysanias in Avila. Why does he mention him? So here's the passage. So look at how many ways he dates. So he's trying to show the audience clearly. I think he's trying to impress the audience that he's really researched this. That's what he says. Remember in Luke's prologue, he says, I researched this stuff from the beginning accurately, with great precision. I know what I'm talking about. In Luke 1, 1 to 4, many people have taken it upon themselves to write up this stuff, but I followed everything in order precisely from the beginning. So here's a sample of what he's doing. In the 15th year of Tiberius as emperor, right, that's 28-29, when Pontius Pilate was governing Judea, right, so he's the junior governor, equestrian, Herod Antipas was tetrarching, he uses the verb, being a tetrarch, in Galilee, and he's using a very precise term, the correct term, actually, for what Herod Antipas was doing. And his brother Philip was tetrarching in Iturea and the territory of Trachonitis. Lysanias was tetrarching in Avila, and Annas was high priest in Jerusalem, and Caiaphas. Now, it's a bit of a curious one because you only have one functioning high priest at a time. But anyway, we'll leave that aside. Already back a century ago, a very conservative scholar named Cronin wrote an article about this, and he said, it's really difficult to understand why he would mention Lysanias in Avila. Like, seriously, he's a minor potentate in Syria. There are lots of others he could have mentioned all around the place, even bigger shots than him. Why would he mention him? Because he doesn't appear anymore in the text of Luke Acts. All the other people mentioned, with the possible slight exception of Philip, the brother of Antipas, but he gets a pass because he's a son of Herod. And if you're going to mention Herod Antipas, why not say that his brother Philip is next door? That's kind of part of the story. But Lysanias is really the odd person out. Why is he there? To illustrate again what I mean. So he says, okay, Tiberius was in his 15th year. Emperor, everybody mentions who's the emperor. That's how you date things. Pontius Pilate in Caesarea, fair enough. Herod Antipas in Galilee, okay. Philip, a little over to the east, good. The high priest, Caiaphas actually, at the time, but Annas had been the high priest, and it was a big deal. So, okay. Those are all contextual, right? For a story that's going to take place in precisely this area. But there are all kinds of other kings and rulers and leaders all around the place, right?
They don't get a mention.
they don't get a mention. Right? All these people don't get mentioned. And then he mentions, and Lysanias was tetrarching in Abilene. Why? Seriously, why would you mention that? It's like saying, and oh, by the way, over in, Cyprus, this guy was in power. Yeah, but he doesn't show up anywhere in the story. And here's the, I owe these next two pictures to somebody named Daniel Demeter. I thank you very much, who took them. I haven't been there. This is the place, and it's been identified. It's a beautiful looking place between Damascus and Baalbek, or ancient Heliopolis. And you can see, I think, this Latin inscription on the wall, which clearly identifies it as Abilene, because it's written in the 2nd century, but it says there was a big flood there and things had to be restored. And the Abilenes paid for the restoration of this area. And you get two other inscriptions. This is the most complete one in Greek of Lysanias. So Lysanias was a famous tetrarch in Abilene, or Avila. Abilene is like the larger territory of a place called Avila. This scribe who wrote this thing didn't know Greek, apparently, because he mishears and puts down a few wrong letters. He's transcribing from something, maybe from hearing, and he just gets a few things wrong. But it's pretty clear Greek, and the translation is on the right side. It's clear what he meant to say, that is. And he says that, so this inscription is for the preservation of people he calls the august lords, and that of their whole house. Nymphaeus, son of Abimenos, freedman of Lysanias, the tetrarch. So I've underlined there, if anybody's reading Greek characters, you can read that, Lysaniou, right, tetrarchou. So this is written by or for Nymphaeus, who's a very wealthy freedman of Lysanias, not Lysanias. Lysanias is gone. He's left the scene. But this guy Nymphaeus, whose claim to fame is that he was a freedman of Lysanias, he began and then fashioned the road. He built the shrine, the temple, that is, and planted all the orchards from his own money. And he dedicates it to Lord Kronos and the homeland for the sake of piety, eusebia, at the end. So for the sake of piety, I'm dedicating all this. So here's a fantastic piece of material evidence from the place that shows that Lysanias had been the tetrarch. And Lysanias issued coins there, of which a few have survived. So this is a famous guy. He was the tetrarch, well, relatively famous, tetrarch of this little region in what is now Lebanon. Right now, it turns out that he's an extremely important character in Josephus. Why? Josephus has a very deep interest in Avila because it's been involved in Judean politics for the past century or so. So in his narratives, he calls this region the house or kingdom of Lysanias as a fixed expression, or sometimes of Zenodorus, because Zenodorus was the son of Lysanias, right? And even long after those guys are gone, he refers to the territory by that name, right? I'm talking about, so just so his audience can keep following what he's saying. I told you about this area of Lysanias. That's the place I'm talking about, even if Lysanias is no longer on the scene. And in Antiquities, 18 to 20, he repeatedly calls the region the Tetrarchy of Lysanias, or Zenodorus, long after Lysanias is gone. So it's a formulaic expression for him. Why is it important? Well, Lysanias' dad was named Ptolemy, son of Menaias. So his son is Lysanias, and his son is Zenodorus, right? Why are they important? Well, they're really active around the 40s and 30s BC, which is a crucial time. That's when King Herod is getting going, when the Romans are securing their rule. The Parthians invade in 40 BCE, the region. So from the east, they invade Syria, and the Romans push them back out and recover Jerusalem for Roman rule and put Herod in charge. So this is a really pivotal, crucial period. That's why Josephus has so much to say about it. Ptolemy, the father, in the 40s, was heavily involved in the politics. He was a backer of the Parthians. He married a Hasmonean woman, that is from the Judean Hasmonean family, the Macedonian family, and was trying to keep the Roman influence out. And he was anti-Herodian. Really didn't like the Herod family. His son, Lysanias, is killed by Mark Antony when he's ruling the East on behalf of the Romans in 36 BCE because of his intriguing against the Romans and against the Herodians. So his son, Zenodorus, leases back a lot of the land in the area and causes trouble for Herod's kingdom. He agitates against both Herod and he runs bandits out of part of the territory, a lot of caves around. Herod finally subdues him. Zenodorus dies of some horrible disease. His stomach splits open or something like that, according to the story. Herod receives his territory, and then later it goes to his son Philip, and then later it goes to Agrippa I and then Agrippa II. But Josephus continues to use this formulaic expression, the Tetrarchy of Lysanias, for the sake of narrative continuity. So his audience will know what he's talking about. I'm talking about that area, the area of Lysanias there. That's what I'm talking about. So I would put it to you that Luke has no reason in his narrative to mention Lysanias tetrarching in Abilene, because it never comes up again in the story. So why does he mention it? It's a curious thing that especially conservative scholars focus on the question of accuracy. Was there a guy named Lysanias who was tetrarching in Abilene in the 30s or around 29 CE? Well, they look back at that inscription I showed you and they say, okay, wait a minute. He mentions these august lords. What does that mean? And so some argue, well, that's really only a possible term after 14 CE because Tiberius' mother, Augustus's wife, Livia, was made an Augusta. That is, she was given the title and renamed Julia, in honor of the Julio-Claudian family in 14 CE. I know this is all heavy stuff, so bear with me for 1 second, because I'm about to say this is not that interesting or relevant, but it's curious that scholars have focused on this question of accuracy. So in other words, if there was a guy named Lysanias being tetrarch in 2930, where Luke implies that there was, then everything's cool. He's correct. The story's right. There would be a Lysanias closer to Jesus' lifetime. And what I want to say is that's entirely possible. I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know if there was a guy who happened to be named Lysanias who had some kind of responsibility for that place in the 30s. I can't rule that out. However, if you look back at the inscription, I don't think that's the most plausible dating. This guy is a rich freedman, and Lysanias is no longer around. So presumably he's an older guy. Maybe let's say he was in his 50s or 60s. It doesn't have to be under Tiberius. It could be under Augustus, because already Livia is given great honors and is called a goddess in sometimes during Augustus' lifetime. So you could imagine that this guy named Phias, if he was given his freedom in his teens, say back before 36 BC, he might be in his 60s and be very wealthy, even in the time of Tiberius, but certainly he could be in his 50s and wealthy in the time of Augustus, paying for everything. So the inscription does not imply that there was a Lysanias at the time of John the Baptist and Jesus. But what I'm trying to say is there may have been. But that's not the problem. The problem is, why does Luke mention him? Why does he want to say there was a Lysanias of Abilene? All the other people he mentions are famous, right? So the simplest explanation, I think, is this, that in Josephus's narrative, he says that because he's always calling this area the Tetrarchy of Lysanias, and that's a fixed expression for him, right? Because it plays an important part in his narrative. Mm-hmm. He says that in the 30s, around 38 CE, Gaius Caligula gave Agrippa I the Tetrarchy of Lysanias. That doesn't mean there was a guy named Lysanias who was handing it over. It's just the name of the place, right? And similarly, a few paragraphs later, he says the Emperor Claudius confirmed that Agrippa should have Avila of Lysanias. That's kind of the name of the place, right? And that's what he's given. So what I'm suggesting is the reason this is there in Luke is that the author of Luke Acts is interested in Agrippa 1 and 2. They turn up and they play big roles in his narrative. And he's simply getting information from Josephus and misunderstands it. He misunderstands the narrative as if there had been a ruler, Lysanias, in the 30s before it was handed over to Agrippa I. That's what I'm suggesting.
I think that's amazing bombshell information, seriously, because I would not have ever been willing to accept that as a fundamentalist evangelical. So this alone right here is amazing information. And I was just about to say that means that Luke's interpreting that with his own different conclusion. I can see how someone would go, oh, no, he's not using Josephus because, look, he doesn't even agree here. They would try to argue that. But really, why is this being mentioned at all? You have a wonderful point bringing that up.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, but again, as you just implied as well, Derek, this is not, we're not talking about ironclad proofs here. Right? We're talking about just thinking through using normal kind of judgments and criteria. What's the best explanation of this real oddity, which everybody agrees is an oddity? You know, why would he mention this guy? Clearly, he's in some way wanting to impress his audience. I'm going to tell you who all the rulers around the area were, but why this one? Well, I think that's the simplest explanation of it. Now, coming to your viewer's question about Theudas.
Yeah, I've always wanted to know about this guy. I've heard just snippets, and I'm pretty sure I have things wrong about this character. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about Theudas.
Well, I'm not sure I have it right. I just can try to provide some background and context. Of course, fundamentally, we don't know any of these guys. They're all gone and dead. But we can maybe make some progress with the evidence for them. So Theudas in Acts appears as just another generic troublesome guy, right? So Gamaliel says, there was this loser guy named Theudas, and then after him there was this other loser guy named Judas, and they were, dispersed and gone. So if that's, God will deal with them if they're just scumbags like those two guys were. But if these Christians are onto something from God, then you better leave them alone.
Right.
Just leave it and wait and see. So, but he's using Judas and Theudas as just kind of names of two examples, right? The author is showing that he knows the history of the region. So, before these days, he says, the story time is in the early 30s CE, right? Under Pontius Pilate, Jesus has just been executed. So before these days, there was Theudas, and then came Judas and the census under Quirinius. Now, what does Josephus say? Josephus' war doesn't mention Theudas. So again, this highlights how you tell a narrative and choosing what you want to tell, right, for the purposes of your story. Then when you retell even the same story, as he does when he rewrites the Antiquities, he chooses, now I'm going to talk about this guy, Theudas. So he's talking, the situation is the mid-40s. He's going in a series. He says there was Agrippa the First, who was king, the whole robe thing. He was praised as a god. He accepted worship. He didn't tell people not to worship him, so God struck him down early. He was only 53 years old in 44 CE. So now the region had to go back to direct Roman rule because the king, the grandson of Herod, was dead prematurely. And his son, Agrippa II, was too young. He was only 16. So the emperor, Claudius, decided he would send a new prefect, like Pilate had been, out to Caesarea. And the first one he sends is named Cuspius Fadus. Now, Josephus describes in Antiquities 20 a few generic kind of issues that Fadus had to deal with. He said there were border disputes between the Jews, and on the east side of the Jordan River, they had got into squabbles there with the people of Philadelphia, Amman today, and they got into disputes with the Idumeans. And so Fadus stepped in and told them off and quieted everything down. He also settled the issue of the high priest robes, who kept these very impressive high priest robes when they weren't being used for the big annual occasions. We won't get into that issue, but those are the two kind of general issues he describes. And then he singles out one individual that Fadus had to deal with, again as a sort of, just from Josephus's point of view, he has no understanding of these people. He just thinks they are degenerate scum, right? Bad guy, disturber. Josephus doesn't give him any human motives at all. But here's his description. While Fadus was procurator of Judea, a certain Goes in Greek, charlatan, wizard, enchanter of a man, so Josephus is not keen on this guy, by the name of Theudas, and he uses the present tense here in Greek, persuades a large crowd to take their possessions and follow him to the Jordan River. For he claimed to be a prophet, and so would part the river by command. So he's got all these people following him way out to the Jordan River in the desert, saying, wait till we get there. I'm going to show you I'm a prophet. And he'll enable them to cross the river. Right? So he's going to redo the miracles of Moses and the Red Sea, and Joshua, especially crossing over the Jordan River into Canaan. By saying these things, he tricked, now this is Josephus' language, of course, he tricked many people. Fadus did not allow them to indulge this foolishness, however, but sent a cavalry wing against them, which took them by surprise and did away with many, though they also took many alive. They also caught Theudas alive, cut off his head, and brought it into Jerusalem. They didn't mess around, right? And the cavalry wing in question are not Romans. They're not Roman citizens. They're from the auxiliary force, because remember, the force in the south is not legions. I showed you on the map, the legions are all very far up in the north. They are the Roman citizen army. These auxiliary forces are locally raised, mostly from Samaria and Caesarea, and they can't stand the Judeans. So they have a historic, ethnic conflict with them, And now they are the army under the procurator prefect based in Caesarea. And so they're only too happy to, wield their swords when the prefect says, deal with these people. They're quite happy to oblige. So it's a very macabre situation, but this was common in the ancient world. Cut off his head, stick it on a post, and bring it to Jerusalem. And Josephus says, okay, that's what happened to the Judeans while Fadus was procurator. You see there his tactic that's very common. He said there were lots of people doing all kinds of stuff, but I'm going to tell you about this one. He's the main one I'm singling out. Now, of course, the guy was there for 2 years in office, Fadus was, and so lots of other things happened, but this is the thing Josephus wants to focus on, right? By the way, he says nothing about this guy being in revolt against Rome. He says he was a prophet, that he claimed to be a prophet, and he was going to do prophet stuff, right? What prophets do, parting a river. That has nothing to do with any anti-Roman activity. Fadus sent the cavalry after him just because he didn't want. He has a big disturbance, right? He's persuading people to take up all their possessions, get rid of their homes, and go out to the desert.
Herald camping, yeah.
Yeah, this is like no good. This guy has too much charisma or whatever, so get rid of him. And Josephus here is on the side of the Roman governor, right? Fadus wouldn't allow them to indulge their foolishness, but send a cavalry wing and cut off his head. Josephus is quite happy about that. He doesn't like any such social disturbance, but he makes an exception for people he considers truly pious people. So his own teacher, Banus, that he went and followed, he said, I lived with him 3 years. This guy was like amazing. And different people he names as Essenes throughout his narrative as well. He has great admiration for them. Similarly, John the Baptist, perhaps the passage on Jesus. He shows great esteem for those kind of people because they're not rabble rousers. They're not, self-promoters saying, I'm a prophet, I'm going to do this and that. They're teaching people virtue, right? So he's okay with them. But all these other characters who in any way are disturbing the peace, messing things up, he doesn't like them. We don't know exactly how he makes that distinction, but he does make a distinction. So Theudas has a prominent role, this is the point, in Josephus' Antiquities 20, not in war. He doesn't appear in war, written in the 70s, only in Antiquities, written, published, finished in 93 CE. So here's the Jordan River. It's a little smaller nowadays than it was back then, but still can be quite fierce. And he says that he's going to cross over with them. What he was really about is actual, whoever the guy was, we really don't know anything. The governor just doesn't like, presumably, any kind of such troublemaking. It's not even clear in which direction he was promising to cross, because he's on the west side of this river, right? So presumably he has to get across it to the east. So that would suggest they're leaving Judea, going over to modern day Jordan. But the miracle that Joshua did as a prophet was actually entering Canaan from the east. So that would be quite comical in a way. I mean, they'd have to go over a bridge to cross the river, and then he would repeat Joshua's feat to come back. You would say, well, why not just take the bridge, But of course, I mean, it's just an odd story. But he wanted to show that he was a prophet. That's what Josephus says. Anyhow, Josephus is against such people. And the point is, he doesn't, because he's an aristocrat, a Jerusalem aristocrat and a priest, he just dismisses them, right? This guy's a charlatan, a crook. He has no interest. And what I'm suggesting to you is that's taken over by Gamaliel in Acts, right? It's not like an independent story. Gamaliel doesn't have any independent information about this guy. He shares that outlook. Now, of course, one way to solve this problem of who comes first that was raised by your viewer is to say, well, there were two guys named Theudas, one before Judas and one after. So if you look at even the Oxford Biblical Scholarship online, it says this. Notice what it presents as fact. There was a messianic preacher, or pretender, pardon me, a messianic So a guy pretending to be Messiah, neither Acts nor Josephus says that, who promised to lead his followers in revolt against Rome. Josephus doesn't say that at all. He's just a deluded prophet in Josephus. Now, that little article goes on. In Acts 5, Theudas is regarded as preceding another revolutionary, Judas. So he's taken. So the author of this, or she, of this article has taken over the attitudes of Acts and Josephus, that these are somehow disturbers, another disturber, another revolutionary. But there's no content there. There's no explanation of what these people actually wanted as human beings. Anyway, the person who wrote this, or she, is interested in is the chronological question. It seems either Josephus or Acts has made a mistake. However, since there were numerous other disorders, it is possible, just possible, there was another leader called Theudas who lived at an earlier date. Okay, almost anything is possible. Right?
Yeah.
Conceivable. Does this chronological difference speak for or against Luke's dependence on Josephus? So you might say, well, if he followed Josephus, he would put them in the right order, right? Well, but he can't, of course, because the speech of Gamaliel is around. No, sorry, it's a little later. It should be a little later than 29. It should be early 30s. But clearly, Theudas in Josephus doesn't come on the scene until more than a decade later, right? So Gamaliel can't say there was Judas and then there was Theudas, because he comes after Gamaliel's story time, all right? So that wouldn't work. But if the author of Luke Acts just needs names of kind of generic rebels, right, Theudas' name would stick out to him if he'd been reading Antiquities, because he's just a no-goodnik, who's causing trouble in Josephus. So in both cases, you have somebody who's just a troublemaker. There's another point I want to make here, which is that the name Theudas is actually quite interesting, because it's a diminutive form of the name Theodorus, just like the name Zenas is a diminutive of Zenodorus, and Pythos of Pythodorus, Metros of Metrodorus. These diminutives become popular, and you can check this just by looking at the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, the collection of all known ancient Greek texts. They become popular from the 2nd century onward, which is quite interesting, right? Like otherwise, earlier, the full names are used: Zenodorus, Pythodorus, meaning gift of. So Theodorus is the Doris, or Doron, is gift, and Theodorus, masculine form, gift of God, gift of Zeus, gift of the Pythian oracle, gift of Apollodorus, gift of Apollo, that kind of thing. Those names become popular later on. So what are the chances then that there were two Greek names? So these are not Hebrew names. These are diminutive Greek names. The chances of two Theudases early in Judea, even one pre-Judas the Galilean, who happened to be kind of generic troublemakers in the eyes of observers. It doesn't make any sense, I think, in my view at least. This, by far, the simplest explanation is that the author of Luke Acts found the name in Josephus and just recycled it. He couldn't put it where Josephus does. He just used it at a different time. And it didn't matter, because it was a passing reference by Gamaliel anyway. So he didn't think anybody was really going to bother about it. So it's most likely, I think, can't prove it, but it's most likely that Luke Acts recalls the name from Josephus's account, which highlighted Theudas.
So the Oxford Dictionary online, whatever, they need to read your book is pretty much what we're they need to take some notes from you on this particular topic.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm
teasing.
I have compassion. I think also that people who write these kind of things have to take account of, broad audience. and they don't want to. They're writing a dictionary type article, so they don't want to, offend a lot of people unnecessarily. So they say, it's possible. But,
Yeah.
anyhow,
I get
go
it.
ahead. Go ahead, Derek.
Oh no, I am jotting. Listen, I'm just gonna put a bunch of notes and take question. Like I'm gonna be question. I've got questions I'm writing down, and we'll get to Q&A. And if anybody wants to ask questions, super chat them. Obviously, I'll take questions either way. I'm just saying, I always try to do that to keep the lights on to do what we do here. But I've already got easily 5-6 rabbit trail type questions that are in the vein of this discussion that I'd love to pick your mind on. So I'm just loving this. Please continue.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm coming rapidly. I hope to a close. There are two more of these things to look at. I don't know if your audience is old enough to know the song "Walk Like an Egyptian." This was a famous song decades ago. Anyhow, so you've got this very peculiar thing in Acts where the Egyptian is linked up with Sicarii and the desert. And it's a curious thing. The ultimate question is, did his parents call him the Egyptian? Because everybody's calling him the Egyptian. Doesn't he have a name? This is actually quite a puzzle. So the story in Acts is that, of course, Paul comes to Jerusalem finally from his trips, and he knows he's going to be in peril there because a lot of Jews and Jewish Christians don't like him. They don't like what they've heard about him. So in Acts 21, he tries to stifle all the opposition, but he gets, there's some Jews from Asia there who say, hey, that's the guy who's been, teaching against us, against the temple, against Jews. And so they try to beat him up. And then it's in the temple near the fortress where the auxiliary army is. So the soldiers rush out. First of all, the people who want to kill him drag him out of the temple. Then the tribune of the cohort, that is the commander of the auxiliary force, comes and arrests him or apprehends him, orders him bound with 2 chains, and asks everybody around, okay, what's he done? Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some shouted another thing. They don't like him. So the tribune just says, okay, we're going to take you back to the barracks, which are right there, the Antonia fortress. And Paul says to him, hey, it's all right if I say something to you. And the tribune hears him speak, so he's speaking Greek. And the tribune says, you know Greek? So you are not the Egyptian who created some agitation a while ago and led the 4,000 men of the Sicarii out into the desert? You're not him? Well, I find this story just quite amazing. I mean, if you just try to think of it as a realistic situation, right? It's a little bit Monty Python-esque. It's like, you're speaking Greek. So you're not, and he doesn't just say you're not, so I thought you might have been, Eleazar. You're not Eleazar. No, he goes on to a whole historical lesson, right? So you're not the Egyptian who did this and did that. And Monty Python wise, you could imagine Paul saying, no, I'm not the Egyptian who did this. And I'm not the Egyptian who used to bake bread on Fridays. And I'm not the Egyptian who, did the other thing. And I'm not the Galilean who, right. I'm not everybody except who I am. So why would you think that because he's speaking Greek, he's not a particular guy? And the story doesn't quite make sense, because it's clear when the tribune went out to get him, he didn't know who he was. He says, what's the problem? Why are you people so upset? What has he done? Right? And some people say one thing, some people say another. So he just drags him. So that's one kind of logic. I don't know who you are, but I'm going to interrogate you and find out what you've done. And so Paul speaks Greek, and he says, oh, I thought you were the Egyptian. Something's not adding up there. So it makes much better sense, not as something that the tribune would actually have said at the moment, rather as something that the author of Acts is saying to his literary audience, right? to say, I know about the Egyptian, I know about the Sicarii, I know about the desert. So he puts all this into the mouth of the tribune. There's some other oddities to the story, which I just mentioned in passing. Who's this tribune? Normally, a tribune, well, Heliarchos in Greek, he's a commander of 1,000. Normally, the garrison, it seems, was 500. You'd have a prefect of the garrison. So there's some other odd things. Is he a Roman? He says so later on in the story. He says, I paid a huge amount to get Roman citizenship. If he's a Roman citizen, he would have joined the legions. So it could be that he's a legionary on his promotion ladder, serving some time as an officer. So he bribed somebody to get Roman citizenship going so that he could join the legion, or his parents bribed somebody so he could become a legionary. Now he's climbing the ladder and he's posted as a commander of an auxiliary force. Anyway, I simply want to say there are some various problems with the story. And especially this thing, he has no idea who Paul is, and then suddenly thinks he's puzzled because he's not the Egyptian. Now, here's some really puzzling bits to this. Greek is widely spoken in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that from inscriptions, even an inscription of a synagogue, which has a rest house for people. It's all written in Greek. You know, it's this famous Theodotus inscription for foreigners who are coming to Jerusalem. They're all speaking Greek. So it's not like everybody who checks into the guest house and they speak Greek and everyone says, oh, you're not the Egyptian? Why wouldn't the Egyptian speak Greek? How else? He's not speaking Egyptian, like ancient, Egyptian. People in Alexandria and Egypt are speaking Greek at this point. So there's some very odd bits to this story.
Yeah, it makes me think something, obviously where we're headed, there's going to be some key evidences here as to why this is relevant.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So it seems he put this in for the literary audience, not as something the Tribune could actually have said. So who are the Sicarii, for example? We'll come back to this in a second. They are concealed knife assassins. It's a Latin term. So there's nobody in Judea who are going to be calling themselves Sicarii. It's a Latin legal term for a knife-wielding assassin who has a concealed, carry of a knife, kills people and then goes off. There's a Roman law, a very, very famous Roman law that's been around for more than a century against Sicarii and poisoners, because both crimes are insidious. They're both sneaky crimes where you're carrying a little knife, you stab somebody, you stick it back in your cloak and you run off, or poison. They're both the same kind of way of killing someone, and very nasty kinds of crimes. So there's a common law against both Sicarii and poisoners. So where do you get 4,000 Sicarii from? And why on earth would you take them to the desert? Because the point of being a Sicarius is to be in an urban setting where you can kill anonymously. So these are all problems. And I think the simplest answer is that this is a mashup from Josephus, because Josephus is the only writer who also discusses an unnamed Egyptian prophet. He calls him the Egyptian prophet. But it makes sense for Josephus to do it for a reason I'll show you in a second. And he's the only Greek writer who uses the Latin term Sicarii, and he does it often. It's one of his favorite words, Sicarii. He uses it all over the place, but it's a Latin term. Why? Because he's writing in Rome, and I'll give you an illustration in a second. And he's also the only guy who talks about leading prophets, leading people out into the desert, like Theudas, right? Theudas led people out into the desert to show them miracles. So in his war, book 2, here's what I'm coming to. In book 2 of the war, he discusses all three of these things, one after the other, in the same passage. Okay? So in war 2, 253 and following, he's just said there were lots of bandits in the countryside, tons of them, right? Just causing trouble everywhere. And the governor at the time, Felix, calmed that down. He dealt with the banditry problem. Then he says a different species of bandit was creeping up in the city, those called sicarii. By the way, I think this name has lingered, right, on famous TV series about bandito gangs today.
Yeah.
Sicarios, right? It comes from the same thing. Anyway, murdering people by day and in the middle of the city. So normally you'd think you'd want to murder people. Well, I don't know, but I think you'd want to murder people when it's not visible, right? In a dark alley or something like that at night. And he's saying they were brazen about murdering people by day in the middle of the city, and especially during the festivals where Jerusalem is packed with people, because they carried concealed daggers under their clothes. And with these, they would stab their foes, and then they'd look around and say, oh, look, he just fell down on the floor. Who did that? They would pretend to be as shocked as anybody else because they just stabbed them with a little concealed knife.
Jeez.
As soon as he's finished saying that, he says the different band of contemptibles. You see his attitude toward all these people. Pure in hand, so they weren't doing any killing, but more impious in their views were these so-called prophets, these deceitful people, rogues, who made a show of being divinely inspired, persuading the mob to be possessed and leading them into the desert so that God would show them signs of freedom in the desert. They were pretending to be prophets, and they would lead people out into the desert in order to do that, as we saw with Theudas, right, from Antiquities 20. But this is in war. So this is a general description of people who did this kind of thing. And now he chooses to give one example. He says, right, notice what he's saying here. There's a whole band of these people. There's tons of them. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 other guys, but Josephus has expanded it into a whole class of people who would lead gullible types out into the desert to display their prophetic abilities. Yet it was with a worse blow than this that the Egyptian pseudo-prophet, that is, I've just told you there were tons of false prophets. Mm-hmm. This particular one was Egyptian. And notice, this is all Josephus needs to say, because in his context, he's saying there were lots of these people, Judeans, right, Jews, who were false prophets. And the worst one of all was this Egyptian guy. So in his context, he doesn't need to name him, because it's enough to distinguish him from the other false prophets to say he was Egyptian. This charlatan wizard fellow appeared in the countryside, and having attracted to himself a prophet's trust out in the outside the city, assembled about 30,000. This is an incredible number, larger probably than the population of Jerusalem at the time. But ancient writers expanded at least by 10, sometimes by 100, the numbers they're using to be impressive. And those who had been fooled were led around by him. He brought them out from the desert, where people like him generally hang out, up to the mount called Olives. From there, he was going to enter Jerusalem forcibly, and after overcoming the Roman auxiliary garrison and the population, to set himself up as a tyrant. Now, this is probably all completely false. If you could talk with the guy, have a coffee with this Egyptian chap, he would probably put his motives a little bit differently. But this is Josephus' way of dismissing him. So there were all these pseudo-prophets, he says, wandering out into the desert and tricking gullible people to follow them. And the worst one was this guy who came back in from the desert, having accumulated a massive following, and claiming he was going to be able to kick out the Roman garrison. He's not yet a rebel against Rome in Josephus' narrative. He's just a would-be tyrant, the way Josephus. He hates the population as much as he hates the Roman garrison. He's going to dominate. He's going to overcome both the garrison that's there, right, the auxiliary garrison, and the population, to set himself up as a tyrant, just because he's a power-loving, no good, disgusting, rotten creep, right? That's Josephus' account. So here's a view, 19th century view from the Mount of Olives looking down on Jerusalem. So he's coming in from the east, from the desert to this place. And he's, so that's a modern day view, looking down, and he's going to take the fortress. So here's an ancient mock-up, or a modern mock-up of the ancient city, and the Antonia fortress, the headquarters of the garrison there marked next to the temple. So the idea is he's looking from the Mount of Olives. He's going to come down with his 30,000 strong people and overcome the population. Now, how best to explain the differences? So Josephus says these were three different groups, right? He says there was urban knife crime on the one hand. Then there were all these pseudo-prophets who led people into the desert. And the worst of that type was the Egyptian guy. And he only just needs to say that to distinguish him from the others. Acts has the tribune say, so you're not the Egyptian who led 4,000 men of the Sicarii into the desert? That's a very curious constellation, right? The three things don't go together. And especially, why doesn't he know the guy's name? That's a crucial question, because the guy had a name, right? And normally Josephus will name, like Judas and Theudas and all these other people, Eleazar's coming out the yin yang. There are all kinds of Eleazar's and Jesus's in Josephus' narrative. He names people. This one he doesn't have to name, because in his account, it's enough to say he was the Egyptian pseudo-prophet. But in Acts, that rationale is gone, right? There were lots, as I said before, there were always lots of Egyptians coming into Judea, and Parthians and everybody else coming in for the pilgrimage festivals. So to say he was the Egyptian doesn't mean anything, to identify him. It's like talking about the American in London. Right?
Yeah.
Well,
there's a lot of Americans in London.
A lot of Americans in London. Yeah, it's not a useful distinguishing term. It only works in Josephus's particular narrative context, right? So what I'm suggesting to you is the easiest explanation is he knew the work of Josephus. He knew these names, Egyptian, Sicarii, big term in Josephus, and he just mashed them up. Because the other two hypotheses, that he knew the events involved, that just doesn't work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he's got them all confused, or that he knew some other source that combined them in this way. That doesn't make any sense, because you would just be multiplying the problem. That would mean there's yet another person who spoke of the Egyptian without naming him and confused everything. It's much simpler just to think that he took this from Josephus, because the Egyptian and the Sicarii make good sense in Josephus. The Egyptian, Josephus mentions lots of people claiming to be prophets. He doesn't need to name this guy. In another context, if he were just describing him, he couldn't just call him the Egyptian for the reason we said. It's like the American in London. So without Josephus' particular context, an independent author would have had to name him. And this suggests Luke's use of Josephus. The Sicarii, as I said, he's the only Greek writer to use the term, aside from Acts. And he uses the word 22 times. And this is what he's talking about. A Sika was a Thracian or Dacian little quite short knife with a significant curve in it. I'm no expert in knife warfare, but I think that this was quite nasty, for inflicting a really serious fatal wound on somebody. And that's why they're called Sicarii, after this Sika type of knife that they carried. So in Rome, this, as I said, is this very serious crime. And you have, especially in Cicero, he uses the term a lot. It's a shock word, right? Sicarius is like, it's a word that gets your attention. Even today, I think it gets your attention. And Cicero uses it both of literal Sicarii, people who are accused for the crime of being a Sicarius, but he also uses it more generally of his political enemies, just as he calls them bandits, latrones. He also calls them sicari, his political opponents, as a kind of term of degradation. Josephus does the same thing. He's living in Rome, so it makes sense for Josephus to use the Latin word because he's writing in Rome. Even though he's writing Greek, he knows that this Latin word carries a real punch for his Roman audiences. It's a real scare word, right? It's a real fear word. So that's how he labels these people in Judea. And he uses it both for people actually doing concealed knife killing, and he labels the people who went to Masada and other people who are not involved in knife crime at all. He still calls them sicari. So he's doing kind of what Cicero did as a writer, frequently using the term because he's in Rome. It makes sense in Josephus to use this language. But it's not at all clear what on earth Luke-Acts could mean by 4,000 sicari going off into the desert, led by the Egyptian. And why is he using a Latin term anyway? Because he's not in Josephus's situation. So the simplest explanation is it's understandable. If he's weaving together these names he knows from Josephus and sticking them in the mouth of the tribune, who it's a very unlikely, he said that's to Paul, but he's writing for his literary audience and impressing his audience with his author's knowledge. So I think that's the simplest explanation. I have one left.
Yeah.
You're still with me?
Oh my gosh. Well, there's 405 people watching right now. Everybody hit the like. Dr. Mason, I love this. This is amazing. I can't wait to get to Q&A. There's so many questions. I hope you have as much time as you took to present to go into questions, because there's so many. You probably have as many questions as we do, and you know so much about this. So thank you. And thank you to the audience for the super chats. I did screenshot some of your super chats. I will show those at Q&A. They're relevant. I just didn't want to interrupt in the particular things you were doing. So I'm ready for number 5. These are all heavy-hitting topics, by the way. I've had other scholars come on and discuss some of this stuff. They have theories, but we're going to get into some of this material. Q&A.
The fifth one is, I think, the clearest case of the method that I was outlining at the beginning, and here it is. And it concerns the Pharisees, and Luke Acts calling them, among other things, the most exact school. School of philosophy implied, but school, even the term school, hieresis. Okay. Now, in real life, there were unknown numbers of groups in ancient Judea, right? I mean, groups we hear the names of in various sources. Baptist groups, the Qumran Scrolls community, the apocalyptic Enochic groups, the Hasidim, the Boethusians, followers of John the Baptist, and a little chronology down the side there, scribes, legal experts, nomodidaskaloi in Greek, the hereditary class of priests, all kinds of groups. And most of them we don't know. We only know the ones that are mentioned, that happen to be mentioned by the sources we have, which are few. So there are tons and tons of groups. Now, different authors, understandably, put them together in different ways, right? Mark hardly mentions the Pharisees, the Herodians, the scribes. He mentions only once Sadducees, Mark does. But he kind of links them up with Pharisees. So he says, basically, Jesus, when he comes to Jerusalem, he fields a question from the Sadducees, who are a nuisance group like the Pharisees are. But in Mark, the Pharisees already try to kill him right from the start. Mark 3:6. They set out to, the Pharisees and the Herodians begin plotting to kill Jesus. In Matthew, which takes over Mark, he adds quite a bit, and he welds the Pharisees and Sadducees together as the united enemies of Jesus. So Matthew 3:7, when it's the Pharisees and Sadducees who come out to John the Baptist, and they're called a brood of snakes, brood of vipers, and they're just bad actors right from the beginning. In Mark 3:6, as I said, the Pharisees are the most prominent enemies. They all want to kill him. John doesn't mention Sadducees, only Pharisees, but he makes them clearly, almost identifies them with the Jewish leadership. They are in cahoots with the chief priests in John, and they are representatives of all Jews. Jesus calls them the children of the devil. They say we're children of Abraham in John chapter 8. He says you are children of the devil, and he's been a murderer from the start. So they are, in John's kind of cosmic picture of conflict between darkness and light, the Pharisees and the chief priests are on the side of darkness. They want Jesus dead, and they're trying to kill him in John 8. Luke Acts, here's my point. Luke Acts is completely different from that. Luke Acts has a totally different picture. The Pharisees are nice guys in Luke Acts, and they are popular with the people, with the common people. And therefore, in Galilee, they accompany Jesus. They're always going around with him. They call him teacher. They respect him. They keep inviting him to dinner 3 times in Luke, only in Luke. I mean, it's unthinkable in John. And it's unthinkable in, I mean, they're trying to kill him in Mark and Matthew. They're constantly criticizing him. It's unthinkable. But here they keep saying, teacher, come to dinner. And of course, he's not a very good house guest. He's always criticizing his guests, his hosts, for being hypocrites and things. But they keep inviting him to dinner and keep respecting him. And they are the ones who warn him to flee from Galilee when they hear that Herod Antipas wants to kill him. So they warn him. And they accompany him to Jerusalem. They go with him and say to him, teacher, like when the triumphal entry and Jesus is hailed, riding a donkey, and they say, everybody's kind of yelling out praise to Jesus. And it's the Pharisees who say, teacher, tell them to cool it. Like they shouldn't be praising you so much. It's too much. But then they're gone. And then Jesus is handed over to the tender mercies of the Sadducees and the temple leadership, who are a completely different group from the Pharisees. The Pharisees no longer appear. And it's the Sadducees, the temple authorities, who are harsh and kill Jesus, want him killed, and then get their way. And they are blamed for his death in Acts 2 and Acts 3. And so Jesus' followers, the apostles, have to deal with the temple-based Sadducees. And the author keeps telling you, these are Sadducees. So it's the priests and the Sadducees who kill Jesus and who want to silence his followers. But we already saw at the beginning, now we're coming around full circle, it was the Pharisee Gamaliel who opposed that. He stood up in the council and said, no, leave them alone. They may be from God. Not only that, many Pharisees follow the apostles and accept Christian teaching. They become Christians in Acts 15 and Acts 21. More than that, Paul says repeatedly, I'm a Pharisee. He's being hauled before the court. He says, look, I'm just a Pharisee. I'm a son of Pharisees. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees group got up and said, we don't find anything wrong with this guy. He's one of us. But he set off a conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then he says here's the crucial bit. When he's hauled before Agrippa II, remember, who's with Berenike, his sister, lover, he says, all the Judeans have known me from the start. I lived as a Pharisee according to the most precise ten akribestaten hieresis. So he calls the Pharisees a school, and this term hieresis, I'll talk about in a second, and the most exact one. The Greek term is a form of akribeia. Akribeia means precision or exactitude, and as an adjective, akribestaten, the superlative, it's like the most exact school. So if you want to criticize me for not being, really kosher, really Jewish, everybody knows me here. I was raised as a Pharisee according to the most exact school. Now, where does that come from? Well, out of all these groups, Josephus chooses three and claims several times in his writings, we have three haireses, philosophical schools, who consider human affairs differently. They are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. So he's the only one we know. We have lots of writers like Philo of Alexandria, who talks about the Essenes a lot. Pliny, the elder, who talks about the Essenes. They never called him a school, and they never matched them up with Pharisees and Sadducees. Josephus is the only one who claims, he pulls together these three groups. Why? Because I think that's a common thing to do in the Roman world. So Tacitus, for example, and Cicero talk about three philosophical positions, basically. You can say that everything is attributable to fate, or nothing is attributable to fate. Everything's human free will. Or you can have a middle position. And that's what Josephus does in Antiquities 13. That's exactly what he says. We have three philosophical schools, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, and they take different views about fate and free will. So the Essenes are all fate, everything's fate. The Sadducees say no fate at all, it's all human will, and the Pharisees take a middle view. Some things fate, some things human will. So he's choosing three groups so that he can compare them, and he does compare them to Greek philosophical schools. He says the Essenes are like the Pythagoreans, and the Pharisees are like the Stoics. And he implies that the Sadducees are like the Epicureans, because he talks about Epicureans as well. And he attributes to them the same beliefs that he attributes to the Sadducees. So he implies that the Sadducees are like Judean Epicureans. So where did Luke get this lingo about the Pharisees being a school and being the most exact school? That's Josephus' language. Now, some of his distinctive view that is so different from Mark and John may come from some other Christian traditions. He may have an independent tradition that Jesus was more friendly with the Pharisees than Mark and Matthew and John said. But his distinctive view of Pharisee-Sadducee relations, his very sharp distinction, the Pharisees as the popular people who are beloved by the masses and would be partners with Jesus in some way, as distinct from the powerful temple-based Sadducees, who are rich folks and aristocrats in the temple, who are harsh and cruel and want to murder. That comes from Josephus. It fits, as far as we know. Josephus is the only guy who makes this kind of distinction and uses this particular language. Many sources mention one or more of these groups, but only Josephus puts the three together consistently and calls them philosophical schools. Now, this word hairesis doesn't necessarily mean philosophical school. It can mean, most often means choice, a choosing, because it's literally a taking of something. It can mean a capture or seizure of something, but half of Josephus's uses of the term are in the specific sense of making a philosophical choice. All right, becoming a philosophical school, taking a philosophical position. So, for example, that passage we read about Judas before, this fellow Judas was a sophist of his own school. For there are three forms of philosophy pursued among the Judeans. The first, hairesis, are members of the Pharisees. The second, the Sadducees, and the third, Essenes. And then at the end of that passage, he says, now, of the former two, Pharisees are reputed to interpret the legal matters with precision, and they constitute the first hairesis, right? So with akribeia, a form of the same word that Acts uses. And again, in his autobiography, when he's talking about a particular Pharisee, he says he comes from the hairesis, the school of the Pharisees, who are reputed to excel the others in their precision, in their akribeia. Now, akribeia is also a big term for Josephus. He likes the word hairesis, and he likes the word akribeia for precision, and he uses it not just of the schools, but also of people who write history. For example, he says Thucydides was held to be the most accurate, the most precise historian, but he's full of mistakes. He doesn't match up to Jewish prophets. So what are unique to Josephus? First, that he selects 3 groups from all the many of Judean groups to compare them with Greek philosophical schools. Second, that he uses the Greek term hieresis, which can mean philosophical school, as a typical term for them, right? That's a characteristic form in Josephus. Third, that he talks about the Pharisees consistently as the one with the reputation for being the most precise hieresis. And then finally, he contrasts the Pharisees very clearly, very sharply, as lenient in punishment and as interpreting the law in such a way that they avoid capital punishment and that kind of thing. We don't have time to look at those passages, but I hope you can trust me. He does that. But whereas he says repeatedly of the Pharisees, of the Sadducees, that they are a priest-based group, they're small and they are harsh in their punishments. By the way, just to illustrate that quickly, some of you will know the passage in Antiquities 2200, section 200, where he's talking about the brother of Jesus, James, being executed by Ananus, the high priest. And he says that Ananus was a high priest and a member of the Sadducees, and they are savage in punishments. All right, so this is Josephus. He presents this in a very sharply distinguished kind of social framework. The Pharisees are very popular. They're known to be lenient in their punishments. That's one reason they're popular. Whereas the priest-based Sadducees, temple-based Sadducees, are very harsh. They don't mind killing people and, so forth. So these are not mere, what my point is, again, coming back to the beginning, Luke Acts is not merely observing reality. He's not just describing facts that speak for themselves. He is reflecting the distinctive choices made by Josephus, which makes sense in Josephus, right? They are part and parcel of Josephus' way of speaking, his narrative perspectives, and they turn up in Luke Acts. So the simplest explanation is the author knew Josephus. He did not know Judean politics and groups at first hand. This is no criticism of Luke Acts, by the way. Who does? I mean, who knows everything that happened a generation or two ago? He's doing what most writers did. He's looking to sources. We know that he used Mark and either Q or Matthew, depending on your view. So which sources did he use for his knowledge of Judea? Well, we know that Josephus was the big guy for Judea. So it stands to reason he would have used Josephus. Every writer presents events differently, but clearly his sources shared what we can identify as Josephus's perspective and distinctive language. So the simplest hypothesis is that Josephus was a source. Now, as you mentioned, Derek, at the beginning, this would date Luke Acts later than about 95, because we know that the date of Antiquities, so Luke Acts is reflecting not just the war written in the 70s, but particular stuff from the Antiquities, like the census under Quirinius. So it would have to be, this would push Luke Acts later than the 70s. But this construction I'm offering to you fits a larger picture that Josephus was recognized as the authority. He likes to zero in on individuals to lend color to his accounts rather than just speaking in generalities. He likes to choose individuals, and those individuals often turn up in Luke Acts. So he does it because he can. He's an expert. He knows these names. He lived there his whole life. So he can draw out these names to show off. Josephus does this to show off his expertise as the authority, right? He says, oh yeah, I'll tell you, I'm in a position to draw out. I'll give you an example. There was this Egyptian guy. I'll give you an example. There was this guy, Theudas, and so on. Well, his characteristic language, therefore, is shot through all of this stuff. So my proposal is that Luke is just doing something extremely similar to what Josephus is doing. He also wants to present himself as knowledgeable about affairs not only in Judea, but when he describes Paul's journeys, also in Greece and Corinth and Ephesus, the silversmiths of Diana and things like that. He wants to show that he has local knowledge he knows what he's talking about. You can trust him, right? That's what he says in his prologue. I want to give you the trustworthy account. Use the term asphalia, the non-slip account of what really happened. So he's trying to bolster his impression of authority, but he doesn't have the personal expertise that Josephus has, so he borrows from the expert. So what I'm trying to say is this is not a criticism of Luke Acts. Neither author is concerned with consistency or keeping all the facts straight, as I think you said before, Derek.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite common to just the point is to make the impact you want to make. The facts, as we care about them, we're not high on people's lists because they couldn't check them anyway. These writers were writing to make more moral facts about moral truth, not whether this happened on this day or that day didn't really matter that much. So Josephus changes things around himself. When he writes the Antiquities, he often rewrites the story, and especially in the Vita, his own autobiography, the stories he told before in the war, he completely rewrites them in quite a shocking way. Gives different names, and so different names of people were present and different roles. And you say, wait a minute, that doesn't add up. We can see Josephus doing that. So it's not actually that surprising that Luke Acts does the same when using Josephus for his purposes, that he should also mash things up. Herewith, I end my little presentation.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Do
I need to pull it back up?
I could be wrong, is what I wanted to say.
Oh.
A user warning on all this. My conclusions at any point could be wrong, of course, but what the important thing for a historian is method. So what I've tried to do, as you said at the beginning, Derek, is to walk through thinking about this, the rationale. Conclusions could be wrong, could be mistaken, but that's,
Wow. Okay, so I'm bringing you back up. So you could see me and I can see you.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, the first thing I want to say, and we've got some super chats. I want to get theirs first before I ask any of my questions. I just want to make a comment about the criticism. And there are Christians who come in here and go, you just love finding out stuff that kind of debunks Christianity. This is what they'll say to me. And I do. I really do enjoy that. I openly say that because I was a fundamentalist Christian, right? So if your version of Christianity is more flexible and liberal, you can accept problems, flaws, human error, and you have that window open, cool. I didn't have that. Yeah. I had a very literal, the men's pen was moved by the Holy Spirit. That was the kind of Christianity I had. So when we talk about, okay, we've seen that this is the way they worked in antiquity, and modern versions of Christianity paint this literature in the way that I understood it. You got to understand why I'm like, yes, I love this, because this takes away that harmful fundamentalism when you start to realize these were humans working with the same, if you could say, hardware we have, creativity that we have. And this is just finding out how they did history, how they wrote narratives. I have so many questions for you. It's unbelievable. But I will say this. When I say Christianity, that is what I'm talking about. People who want to believe, at the end of the day, I have no problem. As long as you're not running around with, God hates faggots and so do I. And those are the kind of Christians. And people who carry this, I have to convert the world mentality. That is my open bias saying, I am standing up to them. I am saying to you, this is what I'm challenging. People have philosophy. I get it. I love you. I don't care. It's the harmful dangers of this ideology. I'm going after the Sakari versions of Christianity that are taking their spiritual knife and trying to cut everyone with it. And I'm saying, no, I'm done. I'm tired. So anyway, I apologize. Did you want to comment on that before we get anything?
No. I don't think there's anything to disagree with in what you're saying. You're coming from a place where I also came from, and I felt that reaction It's just for me now looking, I'm a little older than you are, and or a lot older than you are, and so looking back on the whole business, I would say, of course, I would tend to forget there's lots of other kinds of Christianity, and that have made their peace with historical criticism, historical analysis, and it's not a big issue for them.
It's not. So I just left Dr. Delcy Allison Jr.'s house at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's got the massive home there. Christian conclusion. He's a universalist too, so he's got a happy ending for everyone, which I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I have Ian Mills, PhD student at Duke University. He's a Christian. He openly says the apocalypse failed. There's and I'm like, of course, in my head, it's hard for me to make sense of this. And I'm like, off air, I'm like, hey, I got to ask an honest question. I can't record this, but why are you a Christian then? And he's like, I love Christianity. I love morals. I love loving people, self-sacrifice, concepts, morals, and the tradition. But not because necessarily ontologically everything somehow that doesn't matter to him. And I'm like, well, you're just from a different world than me. And I guess I respect that. But the people who come on here and get all butthurt in my chat from time to time, they're not that kind of Christian. They're the kind that probably were like me, who are out to change the world, who want to change everyone and convert them to their particular ideology. So anywho, let's get these super chats going. We've already gone 2 hours, so 2 hours and 11 minutes. I really, really got a lot of questions, and I'm sure other people will too. First question we have is from John. Thank you so much for the super chat, John. He says, why do you think the author of Luke Acts didn't discuss Paul's death? Was he planning a part 3 and died?
That's a very good suggestion, actually. I don't know. I don't know any more than anybody else does, and I don't have a big theory I'd be willing to go to the mats for. But my only thought relevant to that is writers do what they want to do. They choose their beginning points, end points. They're not driven by the facts, and this is a very good illustration of it. This author surely knew that Paul had died. I mean, the very conservative argument was simply he wrote before Paul died. He ended his story. He was a contemporary, ended his story before Paul had died, and that's why he didn't relate it. But I think if what I'm proposing has any validity, that can't be the case. He wrote a generation or more later. Many scholars now are pushing the date of Acts into the 140s, 150s. So not many, but a number of scholars are. I don't have any reason to go that late with it, but after 95 or so, still puts a lot of water between the author and Paul's death. So I don't know. But, the fact that Josephus could describe 6 CE without describing the census in Quirinius and all that, it's just like, well, it's amazing what authors leave out when they have a focus. If you look at the structure of Luke Acts, there are structural parallels between Luke and Acts, for example, paralleling the stories of Jesus and Paul. So there are all kinds of reasons like that, aesthetic reasons, you might say, or even ideological reasons why he would stop where he does. Maybe it was just too big a can of worms. Maybe indeed he was thinking of writing a third volume. I don't know.
Or like you said, if he is trying to backdate, and I'm just speculating here, the Gospels act like they're writing things as if it's on the ground and it's happening at the moment that they're writing these things, in a way that they're giving the reader the feeling that they're there witnessing what's happening. The way that they're writing it's clever. And so why would you want to go, oh, and Paul died? Well, now you're going to give the reader the hint that you're much later, potentially. Maybe they want you to think that they're back in this time that they're really not in.
That's true. That's true. I mean, the we passages in the travel narratives, for example, imply that he's there. That could be. But on the structural stuff, though, remember how Acts ends, right? With it ends in a very powerful way, with the turn to the Gentiles and the stubbornness of the Jews. These are major themes because the whole work could be understood as Jesus lived his whole life within Judean culture, which he did. He goes to the synagogue and all of that. And the gradual breaking away from the Jews happens in stages in Acts, right? Acts 2, Acts 10, Acts 15, Acts 21.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this moving away until Acts 28, when finally Paul kind of, you are stubborn and hard-hearted and so it could be that his purposes were finished also. But also, these don't need to be mutually exclusive. They can all go together. The idea that he was a fellow traveler of Paul, and he got his themes across very clearly before Paul's death.
So just a comment and then before we move to the next super chat, M. David Litwa, Dr. Litwa, actually, I interviewed him recently, and he does take Luke very late into the 50s, 40s, 50s of the 2nd century.
Yeah.
And I following that, just to ask you to speculate, because it is a guessing game.
Yeah.
Where, if you were to put it on a thing and it's guessing, where would you probably just say this decade? I think it's written in this decade. What would be your guess? Because I know it's a guess. It's just what's your guess?
I actually don't have a guess. I don't care that much. I mean, I don't have a stake in it, so I never had to think about it. Just later than 93, and probably 95 or 96 later than, because it takes time for Josephus' work to circulate. So there are a lot of things that fit. I mean, if you just look at how he positions himself, he talked to people who knew Jesus, kind of thing. So 3rd generation, something like that, would make sense. And there are striking parallels between Luke, Acts, and the so-called pastoral letters, both in vocabulary and the kind of state of church structure, where you have deacons, elders, and so on set up already in the churches. So maybe somewhere around that, somewhere around 100 or so would work. But I have no stake in it. So if it's 140, 130, 140, also fine as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. All right. Flip Flopsky, thanks for the super chat. In multiple instances, names were plucked from Josephus, but not the exact stories. Is it possible that that's where Jesus came from?
So to try to understand the question, maybe you can help me here, Derek, if you have a better insight into the question. But is the question, could the name of Jesus have been a name that was plucked out from somewhere in Josephus? Is that?
I would think, yeah, because we do have the name's a common name, but I guess since Luke's borrowing Josephus in a way to kind of give you this Egyptian and Theudas and Judas the Galilean, etc., could Jesus also be lifted into this?
Yeah, sure, could be. But I think the problem there is you have to explain all the evidence, and there's so much in Luke that is, for example, taken from Mark, and that is in common with Matthew. So, and that gives a much richer picture of Jesus. There's the stuff that is in common with Mark, which is almost verbatim most of the time. There's the stuff that is in common with Matthew, which is very frequently verbatim. I mean, 35, 36, 40 words exact in Greek, same sentence structure. So going back to our first principles, there's some kind of literary relationship there. And then there's, in addition to that, the extra stuff that only Luke has. And there's a ton of that. The parable of the Good Samaritan and the rich man and Lazarus, and all kinds of actually really cool stuff in Luke about what a moral teacher Jesus was, focused on the here and now, and dealing with people decently. So Jesus comes across as a kind of philosopher, kind of like a Stoic, cynic philosopher in some way, in his basic orientation in Luke, and even in that passage in Luke 17, 20, 21, where the Pharisees who are hanging out with him ask him, "Teacher, when will the kingdom come?" And Jesus responds in this amazing passage, which is really close to the Gospel of Thomas, Coptic Gospel of Thomas, where he says, don't be looking in the sky like, is not coming. It's not coming like that. It's well, entossumen, it's within you or among you. But anyway, it's a potentiality that's here now. And all his parables about growing like a seed, that's how the kingdom will come. So it's, this gave rise to the so-called social gospel, right? The idea of really trying to build the kingdom of God on earth, also in Catholic teaching. So that's one reason why I emphasize the diversity among Christians, right? Because many Christians have really focused on that stuff much more than this returning savior kind of idea.
Yeah, there's some. Oh man.
Anyhow, to answer the question, it could be in principle, but I think you have to explain all this other evidence,
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty good evidence for diverse traditions about Jesus' actual teaching.
Interesting. Thank you so much. All right, next super chat we have was Alan Bird, and he said the wars were published in 75 CE. If Luke, and I think you answered this, but I want to get his super chat. Thanks for the super chat. If Luke's uses Josephus as a source, how late was the author writing, and does it help place him geographically?
Yeah, those are two separate and good questions. So the geographical thing, I think not. I mean, it could be that he had access to Josephus because he was also in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a simple explanation. May even have heard. I think Henry Joel Cadbury was related to the Cadbury Chocolate Company, but he became a scholar, big name scholar back in the 1910s and 20s. I think that he argued at some point that Josephus or Luke, the author of Luke Acts, may have heard Josephus, reciting a part of his work, and just he got it all balled up in his memory. That's an interesting idea too. If he were in Rome, that would make sense. It's possible, but I don't think you can narrow it down so tightly, because once his works were approved in Rome, he claims that Titus, future emperor, kind of put his seal of approval and said, "This is the guy you should go to for information about the war." So there's that. But as I pointed out, the war, yes, from 75 to 79, it was completed during that period. And by the way, just for your information, it is singular. That it attracted this plural name, the Wars of the Jews, but Josephus' title is singular. I just mentioned for your information,
Awesome.
the audience's information. So the war was 75 to 79, but his Antiquities, Josephus put out his Antiquities of the Jews in 93, and he double dates it. So we're pretty sure when it was. He actually triple dates it. That it's late in Domitian's reign, the 13th year of Domitian Caesar, 56th year of Josephus' life, and he already told us elsewhere he was born in 37. So it's 93 when Antiquities is finished. So yeah, the date then would be later than that.
Wow. All right. Next one we have is Zachary Sorensen. Thank you so much for the super chat. Big super chat. Thank you. What do you think of the idea that the House of Onias had developed a Sikh-like militant sect of Judaism in Egypt responsible for the militant zealot philosophy at Keto's War, i.e. Luke was involving Lucas of Cyrene?
Was invoking. Yeah.
Invoking.
Yeah. Wow. This is a very knowledgeable viewer. Thank you, Zachary. Well, a lot of things to unpack there. The House of Onias. So the Onias being referred to is Josephus claims that Onias the Fourth, back in the time of the Hasmoneans, fled from Judea. Well, back when, a little before the Hasmoneans, when the Seleucids took over Judea, he fled because he was a Ptolemaic supporter, the Ptolemies, and they were based in Egypt. So he went to Egypt and set up an alternative temple, sort of modeled on the temple in Jerusalem. And the Romans destroyed this temple, or closed it down, in mid-70s, 73, 74, as part of their war against this. So Vespasian ordered it closed in the mid-70s. So the question is, the possibility that the Sicarii, with these little Sika knives, set up a Sikh-like community. I think the reference there is to Sikhs carrying the ceremonial knife that they wear under their clothes, which is not unlike the Sikha knife. So the Sikh religious community today. So a Sikh-like community was there. Okay, I don't know. I think there are a lot of moving parts to that hypothesis. But what I would say is maybe the reason that people might think that might seem interesting is that Josephus claims when he's using this term Sikari, I said that he used it at the beginning in a very precise sense for concealed knife murder, right? But then, later on in his writings, he uses it like promiscuously, just uses it for his political opponents. And he calls all kinds of people, the people who went to Masada, they're Sikari. And then he says, at the very end of book 7, there are a bunch of people in Cyrene, Cyrenaica, and Egypt who were Sikari as well. And they were violent people. But he's not necessarily saying they were committing concealed knife crime. He's just saying they were, troublesome people. So I would say that's the explanation, that he's just doing that. He's not actually revealing anything about a historically continuous group from the time of Onias, centuries earlier, that were concealing knives. I think this is more at the level of rhetoric of Josephus. So
interesting.
It's possible that there's more to it than that, but I think that's a sufficient explanation of the evidence.
I had a few Muslims on my channel when I did this live, and one of the Muslims was arguing over this passage that whether it's talking about prepubescent girls or not, like the argument was about Aisha and 9 years old, all this crazy controversy. Well, both the Muslims totally disagreed. Out of nowhere, one of the Muslims calls the other one Taliban. Okay, literally yelling at him, "You Taliban, you're Taliban." And I thought to myself, like, holy crap. Yeah. Now, he doesn't mean this guy's literally out here in Afghanistan, controlling what's going on and trying to, force Sharia and all that. No, like he's making rhetoric and saying, well, you're going too far or whatever. You went too far. So I wonder if there's something like you're talking about, but it is an interesting question.
Yeah.
All right. Scholar Vid, thank you for the super chat. He says, the resurrection. Do you think the hallucination hypothesis has legs? Post-bereavement for Peter and post-traumatic stress for Paul or something?
I think we talked about this a little bit in a previous chat when we were discussing early Christianity, the first generation, and the development of the resurrection story. I don't know, but here's what we can see historically. That the story of the resurrection develops from the earliest account is in 1 Corinthians 15, in that letter by Paul. That's the first description he gives. And there he makes it very clear. He's talking about spiritual body that does not have flesh and blood. Flesh and blood cannot go into heaven. Jesus, who had become, so whereas Adam had been breathed into matter and became a human being, Jesus did the opposite thing. He undid Adam and he became a life-giving spirit. He became a spirit. What goes into the ground is not what comes out. What goes in is flesh and mortal, and what comes out is spirit. So in 1 Corinthians 15, he makes it very clear that the resurrection body is spiritual. I think that's clear. And also that
you'd be shocked at how many people think I'm sure you know.
I know, but just as I read it, I think that's pretty clear because he keeps driving it home. And he keeps saying, when I said resurrection, you all thought I meant physical resurrection. No. That's crazy. I didn't mean that. And the way that people know that Jesus is risen from the dead is that this spiritual presence appears to them. So I don't think we need to resort to the idea of hallucination or any particular psychological disturbance or disorder. And I'm certainly in no position to absolutely no competence to analyze any such mental condition. So I don't know. But I think that if you just take it at pretty much at face value. It's some kind of spiritual experience. I think in that talk I talked about losing my mother and father, and felt that after they died, there are movies like Ghost and things like that, right, where somebody who's died is actually sitting on the chair and talking, or people recognize them. And I always thought that was just weird. And I never had any experience like that. But I did have the experience that because they're so much a part of me, right, and I could hear them from so many times in the past talking with me ever since I was born, their presence is still with you in some way. And it's not like weird. It's not like you actually hear them talking to you, but I definitely felt like them in some way guiding me, that what they'd given me lives on. I can still hear them in that secondary sense, and it wouldn't surprise me at all that what Paul's saying is the people who had followed Christ experienced him. He appeared to them
post-mortem.
But appeared to them how? He doesn't say. And even in Acts, which puts a big premium on the physical resurrection and the ascension, even Acts, when it talks about the way that Christ appeared to Paul, there's nothing like that, right? In Acts, it's either a ball of light or a sound, but nothing visible, but just a voice. And when Paul talks himself about his encounters with Christ, it's like he says, God told me this, or Christ told me this, or I've given you this affliction that you have, for your training or whatever. My grace is enough for you. Don't try to get rid of it. So he's in communion somehow with God, in the way that many Christians have been for 2,000 years. Like the churches I used to attend, the preachers would frequently say, God told me to do this, and I was in communion with God, and he assured me of this and that. God gave me a message for you today, that kind of stuff. So
it might be a combination of scripture and what you're talking about with this kind of personal kind of relationship idea. Christians do this all the time, every day. Maybe Paul has something like that. But this made me think of ancestor worship, just a little bit, like how it's not a large leap to see why people worship ancestry.
That's right. I agree with you. I mean, from the backgrounds we both come from, it sounds totally weird, right? In Korea or Japan or Eastern places where they have the kind of cult of the ancestors, they worship the ancestors. But actually, in terms of showing reverence to your parents and to the people who have gone before you and their spirits, it's not such a weird thing. It's not a million miles away from this. I agree with you. Anyway, the last point I wanted to make was what you can see historically in the tradition is that wasn't enough. This idea that, how do you know Christ is risen? Well, he appeared to me. I feel his presence. That was not enough for
that didn't sell the package enough. Yeah.
Right. And so they increasingly, as the story gets retold, first in Mark, the earliest one, it's very brief, but now there's an empty tomb, right? And then in Matthew and in Luke and in John, there's a clear effort to concretize, to make it physically real. So in Matthew, the guard said over the tomb, which isn't there in Luke or John. But there's a guard set over the tomb. And this is to enhance the idea. There's no way that tomb was empty. There's no way the disciples took the body or anything like that. In Luke, there's the constant testing of the physicality. Like they think they've seen a spirit. And Jesus says to them directly, a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. And then in John, come and touch me, put your finger in the wounds, right? So there's this increasing emphasis on physicality, and that, but of course that creates a problem. once Jesus is physical, where did he go? Right? And that's why Luke Acts has the story. Okay, well, he stayed for 40 days, and that gave sufficient proof to everybody that he was raised, and then he ascended to heaven after that. And so any appearances after that are going to be different from the 40-day period, which he gave to his apostles, his authorized apostles, and they actually saw the reason. So once you concretize that, it has implications then. But for Paul doesn't know anything about the 40-day period. He says Jesus appeared to him last in the line, which is not what Acts says. Acts says he appeared for 40 days to the 11, right, the apostles, and then later to Paul in a totally different way, because he'd already gone to heaven. For Paul, he doesn't know that story. So he just says, he appeared to me last of all. I was born out of time, but I had the same appearance kind that the other guys had, the 500 and the James and Peter and those guys.
Yeah, he doesn't make a distinction. He doesn't do any of that. No. This is a great point. Oh man, I had something I was going to say in the vein of this that you're talking about. That's really, it's really interesting. Just going along with this. Oh, there's even Christians, and we'll get to the next super chat here in just a second. But there's even Christians that I know when I became a full preterist, which is such a completely minuscule 0.00001% of the population of Christianity, but they saw that the end happened. They believe the parousia and everything happened in the first century, literally in some way.
Yeah.
And then they have to make this explanation. When Jesus ascended on high, well, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. So he physically rose, but then somewhere along the way, he discarded his body. Now that's heresy against orthodoxy later on down the road with when you have the hypostatic union. But it's just, it's so funny to see people how they did this and what they're trying to do. Anyway, I just want to make that note, and then we'll move on if you're cool. Good. All right, Tina, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate the love. Thank you so much. I didn't see a question, so I just went ahead and moved forward. So thank you for the love. Pet Mark, thank you so much for the super chat. Acts, the high priest authorizes Paul to pursue the Christians. Later on, is slapped by the high priest and does not recognize him. Were two authors?
Yeah. Well, it's a question of who's the high priest at the time. They're different guys, right? And so it would be Caiaphas back at the time of Jesus' death, and so from 18 to 36, 37, it's Caiaphas. So that would still be Caiaphas at the time that Paul is hassling the early Christians. But it's not Caiaphas anymore in the 50s and 60s. So Ananias is the guy named in the story, Hananiah. I think that would be one level of explanation. But I don't think, to be honest with you, my own reading of the story is that this stuff is full of irony in Acts 22, 23, 24. Like the examples I gave about Felix and Drusilla and about Agrippa II and Berenice. I think there's a lot more going on in the story. So when Paul says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know he's the high priest," I think that's not really plausible, even within the story. I mean, I think that the author is having a bit of a joke there. So Paul can speak frankly. So this idea of frank speech, parousia, is a major theme in Luke Acts as well. That they remember that apostles speak boldly, without any constraints, no diplomacy. They just speak the truth. And that's not what you do in the Greco-Roman world, right? That's the one thing you never do, because it's dangerous to speak to power, speak truth to power, as we call it today. But that's what they do, and they almost get killed for it. And that's when Gamaliel steps in and protects them. But that's their whole deal. And I think that the story in Acts 23, 24, 25 appearing before the high priest and then the officials is all full of irony like that. So Paul is just speaking boldly, right? Because that's what he does. And then, oh, how dare you speak so, rudely to the high priest. Oh, I didn't know he was the high priest. I'm sorry. How could you not know he was the high priest? The guy's there, probably attended by, his whole posse there. Surely he knew he was the high priest. Anyway, that's my suggestion.
Thank you. Alan Bird, he says, thank you for the super chat, Alan. When rebel leaders were killed by the Romans, their followers were also. The early church set up shop in Jerusalem. Were the leaders not in danger?
Yeah, that's a good question. Clearly they were. I think even according to this story in Acts and also in Paul's letters, like the letter, especially the letter to the Galatians, in chapter 6, he makes an interesting comment, really interesting comment, that those who want Jesus' followers to be circumcised only do that from fear of their own persecution, being persecuted because of the cross. So, it's not exactly clear what that means, but it could be that they're getting a lot of heat for this whole deal of proclaiming Jesus to the Gentiles and all that. So at least if Gentiles come and become Jews, that's not a bad thing. That happens otherwise. But if they're just following this Jesus, and so in Acts, you have in Acts 2, 3, and 4, the authorities are indeed clamping down, trying to silence Jesus' followers and threatening them with death. And so like Peter's imprisonment, also in Acts 12, is about that, right? These are being told by the authorities to stop it, to shut up, and they will be killed if they don't shut up. And that's when they say, well, we can obey you or we can obey God. But then this whole frank speech thing comes up repeatedly. But yes, to answer the question, yes. Why didn't they kill Jesus' followers immediately? I don't know. But I suppose a practical reason would be, where do you stop? How big is the circle? And is this what you really want, this kind of grief? Or do you just go for the head of the operation and try to shut it down like that? Targeted assassination sort of thing.
Yeah, and it really makes me wonder what he did. And it just depends on what scholar you talk to. This is the wild thing about this whole thing. We don't have amazing data. So if we're using Gospels and assuming there's historical nugget, then you have Romans crucifying him, or in some way he's being punished, killed, hung up on a cross, whether he was alive when he was actually hung up on the cross or not. So all these questions that come up. But the point is, why did they actually kill him? And the Gospels don't agree. I mean, you've got him cleansing the temple and a blasphemy for claiming to be equal with God. And no, he was just, claiming to be king of the Jews, or people were saying that he might be. And so here's a potential power struggle that they're not okay with anyone saying king of the Jews.
Although I think most historians don't have such a problem, to be honest. I think at a kind of theological level, one can have all kinds of debates. What did he say? What did he believe that would have offended? He said, I'm a king. Did you say you're a king? We don't like kings, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that's more at the abstract level. Most historians, as far as I know, my former teacher was E.P. Sanders. He wrote a great deal on this subject. And I think most people have agreed with his analysis that simply Jesus last week in Jerusalem. So he lives mostly in Galilee, right? And he's not really hassled there, except that Luke claims that Herod Antipas wanted to arrest him. Maybe not. But where he really gets into trouble is when he goes to Jerusalem. What does he do in Jerusalem that gets him into trouble? The so-called cleansing of the temple. The place is packed out for Passover, where the population triples or so, with people coming in from all over the place, and they're changing money so that they can pay for sacrifices, so that they can use local currency. And so there are, tables set up everywhere for this, to buy sacrifices and things like that. And then Jesus comes along, and according to the Synoptic Gospels, John puts this at the beginning of his career, but the Synoptics all agree this was the trigger event. So he comes into Jerusalem and then starts kicking over all the tables and abusing everybody. Well, that's the kind of thing that might get you into trouble, with any authorities, both the Judean temple authorities and
the Romans.
It's not like the Romans are there in a big presence. They're not. It's only this procurator Pilate and his immediate circle of few guys are Romans. The rest are the auxiliary, local auxiliary army. So yeah, he gets into trouble with them.
Thank you. Appreciate that. William has a super chat. Thanks for the super chat, William. Always love your comments and questions. At what point in time did the focus of Christianity change from a belief in the early return of Christ and the apocalypse to the need to establish a church with firm beliefs as a set hierarchy? That's a great question.
Yeah. Can I study it for a second? At what point did the focus of Christianity change from a belief in the early return of Christ and the apocalypse to the need to okay, yeah, I got it.
Yeah, apocalyptic prophet to, well, we're going to be here for a while. So
yeah. I would suggest a slightly different way of looking at it. In the lecture on Christian origins, first generation, I argued that right from the beginning, actually, so rather than think of Christianity as a lump sum that in a linear way underwent this change, Christianity was first apocalyptic, expecting the imminent return of Christ. Then that failed, then it changed, and then gradually developed into a more realized eschatology, church structure, all that. I think there's something to that, but it's also clear that from the beginning there were at least three different directions in Christ following. So instead of this linear model, there were people right from the beginning. So in 1 Corinthians, you see Paul combating this idea that a Christian idea that the resurrection is a silly thing to think about the physical or future resurrection or waiting for Christ to return. No, we've already been raised. We've already experienced the transformation because Christ came to give us wisdom. That's what Christ is. He's somebody who imparted to us wisdom in the world about how to live. And you should get busy doing that and enacting what Christ taught rather than waiting for some, heavenly thing.
We even see like two heretical named people who thought the resurrection had already happened within the New Testament.
Yeah.
What were their names again?
In the pastorals.
Yeah. But I don't know how late that, you know how it goes. So
that's usually like dated to the, late first century, early second century. Yeah. Well, around the time of whenever Luke Acts was dated. And Colossians, the reason that Colossians and Ephesians are thought by many people not to be Pauline is they say that. Those two letters actually say we have been raised. All right. We have already been raised and we have all fullness. Those letters continually talk about the fullness of knowledge and the fullness of love. That's exactly what Paul was arguing against in 1 Corinthians when he said, we don't have perfect knowledge. We see through a glass darkly, and only when Christ returns will we really know and have any knowledge. But he criticizes in 1 Corinthians 4 those people who say, already we have become kings, already we have knowledge already.
Proto-Gnosticism.
Yeah. So that fits with this Gnostic tendency, right? Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly. Yeah.
Man.
So to answer the question, therefore, if you're asking at what point did this change happen on a line, I'm suggesting that actually you have three different perspectives right from the beginning.
That we know of.
These are just the ones that come to the fore in the text. But that apocalyptic imminent idea didn't die out, actually. So it's not like you can say it gave way to the notion of church structure and all that, because towards the end of the 2nd century, you have the Montanists, who are super imminent return people. And then you have even Tertullian, who is still looking for Christ's return at any moment, right? Mm-hmm. And this is around 200 CE. And then you have people like that throughout the Middle Ages, and I mean, that's how I was raised as well, to be waiting for the imminent return of Christ. So that never went away. But it's a different strain of Christianity from the other one, which is not to say that there wasn't also some evolution for some people and settling down to church structure and all that. But yeah, I think it's quite messy, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much. My friend Aryan, thank you so much. He says, still find it remarkable that Acts isn't the Acts of all apostles and that Paul evaporates at the end of the book. Take care, guys. Well, thank you. Yeah, I think it's an interesting book. It's supposed to be the Acts of the Apostles, but who are the two guys who really get the spotlight? The two ones who clash in Galatians. And it's like, maybe there's something going on here. I'm a big fan into looking into this, but most people think that, well, they had a small bump. Don't overthink it. There was no really drastic difference. I mean, look, even James and Peter signed off on Paul's gospel. Everything's good. What are you talking about? They were best of buds. They just had a small minor infraction, and that was it. I'm not convinced of that. I look in Corinthians and these so-called these super apostles. I'm like, that doesn't sound like he's very friendly, and I think I know who he's talking about. At least the group of people. It sounds like.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I tend to agree with you, Derek. It's
can't prove it, but it seems like this leans in that direction.
Yeah.
So, all right, couple more here, and then I know you got to go because it's getting late over there where you're at. One day I got to meet you in person. Yeah,
it's getting dark here actually, but I've got lots of light on, so.
Okay, if you're okay, I'm okay. I just don't.
Yeah. I'm okay.
Okay. Mitch, thanks a lot, Mitch. Man, you're always coming through, and he's a mod here. He keeps law and order over here when the crazy trolls want to come take over. Can Dr. Mason name some scholars writing on trade, labor, and industry in the ancient Near East, and perhaps more specifically in the region of Judea, Israel? There does not seem to be a lot of books covering it.
Oh, okay. Scholars writing on trade, labor, and so on. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of scholars who deal with socioeconomic conditions in the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean, and Judea. So in Judea, in Galilee, I see Mitch, right? It was Mitch?
Yeah, Mitch.
Mitch is... apparently Canadian, right?
It's a good question.
It looks like it's a donation.
Mitch, are you Canadian, Mitch?
Using Canadian dollars anyway, I think.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, that's where he's at.
So, greetings to a fellow Canadian. Fantastic. So in Canada, as it happens, there's these are strong interests, the socioeconomic conditions of Judea, Galilee. So the whole group that came through the University of Toronto with John Kloppenborg is the kind of
the key
guy. Yeah. And that's Bill Arnall, William Arnall, Richard Askoff, Phil Harland. These scholars are all very much interested in trade, social, economic conditions in Judea. On a broader scale, Steve Friesen for Judea. A few names, Gildas Hamel. There are a few names from the past that kick around in my brain. And then there are a bunch of Israeli scholars who focus on the social and economic conditions, but not just pre-70, sort of extending it into the rabbinic period. So in the 3rd and 4th century, there are such people. I dare not try to remember their names, but there are a bunch of people who focus on it. It's later than my main focus of interest. For the Greco-Roman world as a whole, yeah, there's a whole bunch of Garnsey and Saller, that is, wrote and Moses Finley, Garnsey and Saller wrote these kind of economic histories of the Roman Empire, really kind of hardcore economics. And then people doing demographics, also Scheidel, Walter Scheidel, very much interested in sort of long span economic conditions. So anyway, those are some starting points, perhaps.
Thank you. Thank you. Flip Flopsky is back. Thank you so much. Paul was writing to Christian churches. Christian churches must have had Christian text. Yes or no?
I'm not sure, Flip Flopsky, what's behind the question. What do you mean? So Paul, I mean, we've shifted, of course, from the topic of the presentation, but Paul's writing letters. So the problem I'm having is, where does the term Christian come in? Yeah, these people were believers, Christ followers, but say Paul's followers in Thessalonica, he just rocks up in town and finds some people there in a house. He gathers some people. He's doing his trade, maybe leather work or whatever, tent work. He gathers some people and he persuades them that Christ rose from the dead and is coming back from heaven. So I'm not sure where your question fits in. When he leaves, he writes a letter to them.
I think he's saying what kind of scriptures that they were.
Oh, okay.
This goes in. I think they're using this Septuagint. I mean, if they're using this, this is an interesting question, because are they at synagogues? Are they just in houses? If they're just in houses and you're bumping into them, what kind of literature do they have?
Well, for Paul's followers, here I part company with a bunch of scholars today. There's a whole. Right. I think the majority of scholars want to see Paul nowadays. This was very different 2 generations ago, but nowadays want to see Paul as a practicing Jew who was really kind of extending Judaism to his followers. I just cannot see that at all in any way, shape, or form. His followers were mainly Gentiles, and not only did he not tell them that anything about Scripture, but he got quite upset when other people did. And tried to get them to follow Scripture. And then he ends up trying to use Scripture to say you don't need to follow Scripture. So he, like in Galatians, he can see that they're buying the authority of Scripture from these other teachers. And they're thinking, hey, we should become Jews, we should be circumcised. And he's saying, no. And don't you realize that Scripture itself said you don't need to follow Scripture? So he cites, for example, Habakkuk 2:4, which says, in Hebrew it says, the person who is just or righteous will get by, will live, will have life from their faithfulness. He reworks that according to the Septuagint version to say, he who is righteous by faith will live, not by following the law.
Yeah.
So he completely inverts the sense of the passage, which was that, you should follow the law. That's what makes you righteous, and that will give you life. You will live, you'll have sustenance by following the law. And Paul says, no, it says, instead of saying he will live by his faithfulness, he translates that as is righteous by faith in Christ and not by following the law. So my point is, he gets into this very curious position of having to prove from the law that you don't need to follow the law, which is amazing. But he does it. That's what he does in Galatians.
Leads to just the final conclusion on that particular question, I guess, to ask is, would this mean that the early teachings of Christianity at these house churches are probably oral teachings instead of literature, and that over time, what we have are these letters, and we're hinging everything on these letters, but really it's an oral movement at this moment, or at least we don't have documentation of whatever maybe the teachings early might have been. We talk about Q source, we talk about these things, like, could that have been floating around? Maybe, but it's very confusing. But I guess
Yeah,
what are your
yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. That is, it's mostly oral, I think. In fact, the culture generally, the literacy level is very low in the Greco-Roman world. The studies that have been done, this is part, by the way, this is part of that question about social trade, economic conditions. That's all tied in with questions of literacy, also demographics, disease, epidemiology, all of these kind of things. So William Harris has done some work, and others have. Catherine Hescher. Oh, Catherine Hescher, by the way, is another one on social economic conditions in Judea. She's tackled slavery, literacy, some big kind of social economic issues. Catherine Hescher, Hezser. Good stuff there. So where was I going with that? Oh,
Orality.
Literacy and orality. So literacy has been estimated, generously at 10%. Well, it depends what you mean by literacy. Sort of people who really know literature, who can write good Greek, or people who can write a sentence or sign their name or something like that. So it's usually estimated that somewhat under 10% of the population, because we can't think about our world where everybody goes to school. This is quite a recent development, in the West, where everybody goes to school and it's compulsory. This was just not the case in the ancient world. So most people didn't have that benefit. So the idea of a literary culture, it can't really work except for the elite, for this very small group, maybe 5-6% of the population who really got high on literature and text. But the rest of the people, these are agrarian societies. They're working on farms all day long. They don't have time for that, or they are merchants, right? And they can do some, they can write a receipt or something like that, but they're not literature people. So and remember too that ancient texts are written out to save papyrus or vellum or whatever space, are written out in continuous script with no dividers between words. Like, this is a nightmare to sit down and read. So we don't really have much evidence of people doing that. Even when elite people read, it's usually that they have, like, I subscribe to Audible books, and I feel like an ancient person, like as if I had a slave, right? So in the ancient world, they had their own Audible version, but they had some slave, right, who read this stuff out, because they can't be bothered. I mean, these messy rolls, and they're not going to sit there poring over these things. So I think we need to get away from the idea of that kind of literacy where it's really text-based, because they didn't have the technology for it at all.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sentinel Apologetics, Rob, I believe it is, from Sentinel Apologetics says, what's Dr. Mason's view in Jesus mythicism?
Yeah. Well, how much time you got? We've discussed this a little bit before, so let me just summarize it if I can, in a couple of sentences. First of all, I'm no expert, right? You've invited me, and Tim Mills has invited me in for podcasts, and so I've gotten to know a little bit more. I've known a little of the work of Richard Carrier and some of the other names, Dr. Price in these areas. My sense is that I'm just a historian, trying to explain evidence, and my view is that mythicism, I suppose, means different things for different people, but the form of it that proposes that Jesus of Nazareth was not a real guy, but that earliest Christianity is an amalgam of Egyptian and other myths. For me, that it doesn't work. I mean, it just doesn't explain the diversity. And here's the crucial point, because when I have looked a little bit at these kind of arguments, it they seem to suppose Christianity's a thing, like a package of some kind that was put together and formulated this way, borrowing from here and there. That's just not the view that I have. If anybody's followed my first and second generation Christianity podcasts, or I think that right from the beginning, we see such diversity and disagreement among those who say, I knew him, I'm his brother. We hung out with him, you didn't. You just had some dreams about him, Paul. We actually knew the guy. And all the diversity that's right there from the beginning, and the really bitter, as you said, 2 Corinthians 11:12 about, servants of Satan, hyper apostles, all this stuff. It's just easier to explain, I think, if they're fighting about the legacy of a real guy.
I with you 100%.
Yeah.
I was a mythicist, and it was not one piece of data. Someone goes, give me the evidence, man, shut me up. And I'm like, it's not like, oh, well, here's his leg bone, we know he's there. No, there's a lot of material for me that leans me and convinces me of the overarching picture. When I back up, it makes me see and go, to me, this makes more sense. I'm not saying I know. I don't have the confidence of like omniscience or gnosis that I know this. Okay. And this is the thing, the confidence level I have, I don't have absolute confidence, but I lean, if you put it on a 1, like to 100%, I'm on the side that there was a guy.
Yeah.
But I also am on the side that there was a guy that was highly mythologized and legendary. He was made into something that what he really was isn't that. And I've actually had talks with some of my friends who are mythicists, and they say, we got a lot more in common with Christianity in terms of how we understand this heavenly figure, Jesus, that comes down, he descends from heaven and all these things, or at least comes down to a lower heaven. There's a lot in common, though, with the way that Christian Christology and theology works that mythicists are still harping on, even though they may not ontologically believe it. And so anyway, Rob, thanks for the super chat. Thank you for answering the question. I'm definitely with you on this in particular. Couldn't prove him. I'm not going to die on the hill to the point to where I'm going to go out there bashing everyone who doesn't agree with me on this. But I hope my goal is to get people to be less dogmatic of being mythicist, right? Because they run around, Jesus did not exist. Well, if you want to say that the figure that has been painted, the Christ figure, then okay, I'm with you on that. I guess you could say in that sense, I don't believe that figure existed. So then you could call me, and this is bad because the definition for Christ mythicism is mythicism, but I'm saying the Christ didn't exist. The man Jesus, I think there probably was a guy. And I know it gets into like the weeds of trying to define these things, but I still value Richard Carrier, Dr. Price's insight. Dr. Price is one of my best friends who lives an hour from me. So to address Rob, just so you know, because I've seen you on with S.J. Thomason, and we haven't got to talk yet. I definitely look forward to talking to you. When I first started MythVision, the closest and only PhD scholar that I knew was Dr. Price. And I've grown to have a great relationship and friendship with him, even though he knows I'm a historicist. It's like I look up to him. There's so many interesting things. He's an encyclopedia of information. I value his friendship. I value him more of a friend than anything, but he is so insightful. And so I do look to these people and still filter. I call it chew the meat and spit out the bone. And I can tell you this, I'd listen to him every day before I'd listen to someone like William Lane Craig, Frank Turek, popularized people who are out there trying to push an apologetic. And so in my mind, that's the guy I'd rather listen to, even if I go, I think you're going too far. Sometimes critics go too critical and they go a little too far. My opinion. I've told him this. Like this is nothing. I'm not saying this because he's not around. Me and him talk about this stuff all the time. So thank you.
Can I add one thing, Derek?
Please.
To that? What you put your finger on something there that's really kind of important for this. It seems to me. I don't understand what the difference is and what's at stake for people in the difference between saying, okay, there was a man, Jesus of Nazareth, and then there was a huge debate about, and this old mythologization took place in certain streams from this guy, which he knew nothing about, and saying there was no guy, and all this mythicization took place. I don't really understand the need for the negation of the guy. And what I mean by that is the notion that Jesus of Nazareth was heavily mythologized is no news to any New Testament scholar. That was already argued from the Enlightenment onward by pretty much, all the major scholars you learn about when you study this field from the 19th century. David Friedrich Strauss, and then I can't remember the guy, 1890s, wrote a book called the so-called historical Jesus and the historic biblical Christ. So, and then Rudolf Bultmann and others who came in his wake, they all made that distinction. There's the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, right? That was like basic to everything. They said the Jesus of history, or even Albert Schweitzer, or even way before him, guys who argued that Jesus was a frustrated apocalyptic preacher. That's who the real guy was. I don't quite agree with that analysis, but anyway, that's what they argued. And then he was transformed into something else later. I don't see the difference really between saying that, which is a perfectly standard scholarly position for the last 300 years, and saying, okay, there was no guy and he was mythicized. So that picks up.
They just have a difficulty seeing what the guy really said or really did, and these are the problems. We have a highly mythologized theological text. We don't have Paul talking about his earthly ministry, his miracles. It's there's too many question marks for them, so they're highly skeptical, and they're already thinking the church is biased. They see interpolations, they're seeing problems, so they're already in the kind of, I don't want to use the conspiracy theory, but it's like kind of they're like you're making this man more physical even throughout the Gospels, like we talked about this whole resurrection thing. So they see euhemerization, and I get it. I was there. I know exactly how the thinking goes. And then they see other characters, like look at the founder of Rome, right? Romulus. There's biographies written about this guy who never existed. And they're like, see, so in their mind, they're using other characteristics of other examples to try and see this. And I get it. At the end of the day, I don't die on this hill. I literally just say, look, at the end of the day, I think we all agree the Christ figure, the critical skeptics college, we all agree the Christ did not exist. So I'm not going to argue all day long, but I ask the mythicists, don't be so dogmatic either. And it's not all mythicists. There's some that come on my chat and they're like, he did not. And it's almost like, well, if he did, does that mean you now have to worship him? It's weird. It makes makes me think psychologically, like, are you a mythicist just to kind of run away from the belief? I don't know. I mean, that's me psychoanalyzing, but let's move on. We got some more super chats. Tina, thank you again, sweetheart. I really appreciate you super chatting. I hope I didn't miss anybody. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Here we go. Dude, I hope I didn't miss anybody before Chris. Christopher Malloy says, thoughts on Roman provenance theory. Do you know about this theory?
Well, you have to tell me what it is. I'm not sure.
Depends on who you ask, but ultimately that Christianity was developed or in some way created by a top-down creation.
Oh yeah. I get it. Yep. Yes. I've known about this for a few decades, or two and a half decades. A couple of guys, when I used to work in Toronto, people sent me manuscripts and arguing. So many of the things that we looked at today, those correspondences, especially between Luke, Acts, and Josephus, I think have underlain this idea. People looked at them and said, that's suspicious, that these different writers are all referring to the same kind of things. And then they extend it quite a bit, like the Gerasene or Gadarene demoniacs, this could be because the demons say we are legion, so maybe this is reference to the legions, and so these. Anyway, to answer the question, it just doesn't explain the evidence for me. And I think the big problem is, again, the difference of outlook. I don't think it takes sufficient account, with all respect for the people who hold the view. It doesn't take sufficient account of the literary, rhetorical dimensions of each distinct author. And so, for example, the idea that the Flavians wrote the New Testament, well, that imagines the New Testament to be some kind of unified product. So, in one form of the theory that I am familiar with, because of the Jewish war, the Flavians wanted to suppress Judaism and to create Christianity as a successor to it. But again, it simply doesn't. It works at some kind of very abstract level. It doesn't work if you sit every day having to work through these texts. So all the diversity among the early Christian texts, all their ferocious bickering with each other about who has the right way, and that only got worse, through the second and third and fourth centuries, as these groups really came to sharp disagreements. In eventually the creeds kind of trying to hammer stuff out. But then Josephus is doing something totally different. And part of this idea builds on an old picture of Josephus as a mouthpiece of the Flavian regime. But I've devoted much of my career to showing, I think convincingly to my own satisfaction at least, that he's nothing like that. He undermines the Flavian self-image, which they blast, in every way they can, in monuments and coins. He undermines this at crucial points, their claim. So he writes as a Judean aristocrat, not as a Roman. He is a Roman citizen, but he's not in the service of the Flavians. He undermines pretty much everything that's crucial. Vespasian's rise to power, his portrait of that in Book 4 of the Jewish War, is not the Flavian portrait at all. He gives a different date. The Flavians dated their power from the 1st of July of 69. They backdated it, and that was very important to them. And Josephus explodes that whole picture. So it didn't happen, right? He's got a whole different picture. They claim that they had conquered a foreign people in the Judeans. That's what justified their rule and their triumph. You only have a triumph over a foreign people. Josephus writes his entire war to explode that myth. No, we came under Roman rule with Pompey a century and a half ago, not with the Flavians, and we've been close, tight allies of the Romans ever since. So it just doesn't make any sense, is the short answer to me of the work I have to do every day. That I hear the proposal, but it just doesn't explain anything of what I have to do.
Thank you. Sentinel Apologetics, Rob, thanks for the super chat, my friend. Did he ascend into the cosmic sperm bank? Acts chapter 1. So you probably aren't aware of that. That's actually something that Christopher Hansen, back in the day when he was still around on the YouTube, he had like a hangout party where they would just kind of talk about Richard Carrier's idea that Jesus was produced or manufactured in the heavens. So he reads Galatians in Greek there, Galatians 4, where it talks about him being manufactured, or he was born a woman. Manufactured is the potential use of the Greek word. So it's this heavenly sperm bank idea that he's created from. Now, this is something this is a mythicist position by Richard Carrier. And of course, I would say you would not say he ascended to the cosmic sperm bank.
Well, I think I'm not competent to say. I honestly, Derek, have no idea what you're talking about here.
Yeah, I know. That's why it's actually something he builds up in his book on the historicity. And he also has written a book, Jesus from Outer Space. I've got a couple of those books behind me, but you'd have to read it to try and get why he's taking the approach. He has also a whole world, he thinks, in Paul's mind. There's 7 heavens. the way that they believe there are things on earth and there's physical items in the heavens in different layers, that Paul's strange thinking, superstitious guy in these time periods. And so a lot of that is the way he's interpreting his mythicism and trying to wrap his head around what would the mindset have been in this particular time for this guy, Paul.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you'd have to hear his argument that builds up.
Well, I just checked the Greek word in Galatians 4:4 to see if it was an unusual word that might, but it's like the most common 5-cent word in Greek, ginomai, or ginomai in classical Greek, which just means become, and it's like you just became, right, or is, or was born, but it's one of the most flexible words that you come across every 3 sentences or so. This is not to criticize Dr. Carrier's position. He's a smart guy, and I just don't know. I know nothing about it. But my general response to this is I'm not a polemicist. I'm not in this to argue with people.
Right.
I'm just a historian. I may be wrong about conclusions, but in my daily life, my job is, writing commentaries and translations of texts like Josephus. Right now is my main project, and I've done it before with the early Christian texts. And the main problem is that these arguments work at some kind of, like, if you connect this with that and with that and with that, looks plausible. But if you dive in to the text and say, what is this text about? Why did this person write this text line by line? Try to make sense of it as a coherent text, right? It just doesn't work for me. These kind of explanations don't have any explanatory power. This doesn't mean that they're wrong. I may be wrong, but I'm just explaining to you the practical issue that I have.
I get
it. It's not because I think they're wrong or they're absurd or they're ridiculous.
You just don't see that. I get it.
I just don't see how they help me understand what I'm looking at in front of me. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for that super chat, Rob. I appreciate it, and looking forward to talking with you in the future here. Tina, thank you so much, sweetheart. You're always coming through, dropping a little bomb here and there. Thank you for the love. We have Yehuda ben Israel. Israel. Have you ever explored the idea Robert Eisman proposes that Paul is turning the theology of the Dead Sea Scroll around into something opposite of its original intention?
Yeah. Here's, I think, another example. What some scholars do is then they look to, so Barbara Teering in Australia and others have looked to the Dead Sea Scrolls because they're such the Qumran scrolls, because they're such spectacular discoveries in 1947, 48, and so on, to see whether they might have like the golden key to understanding. Just in terms of my historical method, I like to begin with what we have and make sense of each thing on its own terms first. And once you try to do that, if you bring in the scrolls, for me, it's like it doesn't help. They don't help me understand Galatians. They don't help me understand 1 Corinthians. They don't help me understand 1 Thessalonians, Luke, Acts, Josephus, anything. They are what they are, and they should be understood contextually. So, but then even understanding the scrolls, that's usually nowadays a career choice for somebody. It's not something they do on the side, because the scrolls have become, there are conferences on the scrolls. They have huge cachet as a body of, 1,000 or nearly 1,000 texts, fragments. So there's a lot to work on there. And the scrolls are not one thing, right? So there's already a difference between 1QS, the community rule, and the Damascus Covenant, CD. There are big differences between them, and then also between all kinds of other texts, And then questions arise: is it the same community that underwent changes over time, or are they different communities? So there are so the Dead Sea Scrolls are not a thing, right? It's like the New Testament is not a thing. It's a library of different texts with different viewpoints. The 4QMMT and then so-called kind of messianic texts and biblical interpretation texts. Some of them are pointing in different directions and making different assumptions, using different language. So anyway, the answer is no.
I've heard.
I don't find it so useful. No.
When I talk to John J. Collins, for example,
Yeah.
he thinks that he's a maverick, right? He's a well-known figure that pushed a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls to the public and stuff. He had nothing negative to say other than the fact that he says, I'm sorry, I don't draw those conclusions. He's I could give you more, but honestly, I'm retiring on Wednesday. When I went up to go see him because I went and actually saw him at Yale, and we hung out in his office for a couple hours. He gave me 2 full boxes of his books I got to ship home. Him signed half of them, it's really cool. So, but Dr. Collins was just like, yeah, like everyone in the field that's actively reading. And by the way, supposedly he can't read the actual Hebrew. Supposedly, this is what has been commonly understood, is that he's learning from other scholars and picking and kind of putting together these things. I don't know how true that is. This is something that I'm just being told. But
who's the he you're talking about? Eisenman.
Eisenman.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, John Collins. Just to clarify, John Collins is very much an expert in the scrolls.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. But that's what he was saying. He's saying all across the board, everyone that is working with this right now, everyone says that it's kind of fantastic, the approach that he takes. So like you said, it's not homogenous. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not teaching one idea. So now the Gospels or Paul is trying to reverse that one idea. No, there's so many various ideas going on. I have questions though. This raises questions like, is Paul does he know Enochian literature? Is there some type of weird, these are wonderful, interesting things I love to learn. And
well, actually, that's another issue, because there are very many credible scholars. I mean, there's not to say that Eisenman is not. What I mean is, I chose my words badly. What can you say? There are many scholars closer to the mainstream, so to put it less pejoratively. And I'm not saying I agree with these scholars. So I don't mean they're credible in the sense that I agree with them. I just mean, there are kind of circles, social circles, maybe even people who hold central university positions, who are known for expertise in these areas. And then there are people who are more considered generally on the edges, on the fringes. So it's a very tricky matter, and I don't mean any offense to anybody in any of those positions. I've not met most of the people on the so-called edges. What I mean is, there are people in central public university positions who are recognized experts by pretty much everybody, who would hold that Enochic Judaism was a central kind of stream that Paul shared in, for example. So when you ask about Enoch, I have to flag that up and say there's something called the Enoch Seminar, actually hosted by this group of scholars, and it's really a broad range of scholars. John Collins attends some of these meetings. I'm not sure the extent to which he shares this idea, but the idea is that the basic idea is that Judaism, which is a term I'm reluctant to use because it's not in the ancient texts, but anyway, Judaism was in basically 2 different streams. There was the Mosaic stream, Moses' law, and then there was a different stream that was more indebted to Enoch, first Enoch, and it was more visionary, more apocalyptic, more charismatic, more, it's just different.
Yeah.
And that these 2 streams developed, and that Christianity as a whole fell in the kind of Enochic Judaism line. that doesn't help me either. I don't agree with it. So when I say these people are more central, I don't mean I agree with them. I just mean they're
You're just
actually
painting what currently the logistics are for what's going on. But at the same time, I think it is interesting. One of the things John J. Collins says in his Dead Sea Scroll book, and I'll get to Mr. Monster Super Chat here, is that Enoch is pulling prior to Mosaic on purpose. This tradition is going before the Mosaic covenant or law on purpose, and it has this apocalyptic animal vision where all of the animals, wild beast, Gentiles, you name it, it's kind of sidestepping the Mosaic thing and saying no, we're all gonna become. It's almost universalistic in a way, but it makes me kind of think of, are these potential proteges of versions of something that eventually a movement does spawn? And it doesn't mean that they're Enochian, but can we get potential fragments of realities and the way people were thinking about stuff? I don't know. It's an interesting question. So Thank you. Mr. Monster, always coming through. Good to see you here, my friend. And you probably been hanging out this whole time. I don't know. I do believe there was a Jewish man preaching a new gospel in the first century, and he was executed by the Romans, but I don't believe all the other stuff.
Well, there, I think you're in company with pretty much most mainstream New Testament scholars in the past 2 or 3 centuries.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know I hope I didn't miss anyone here. And then I just had a few of my own questions, and I'll leave you be. I'll stop harassing you. Oh no, there's Sentinel. Sorry. I hope I didn't miss anybody. I'll refresh and try and make sure. But Sentinel's question is, does Luke Josephus comment on his Nazareth birth?
Not his Nazareth birth. Luke has him born in Bethlehem. So going to Jesus born in Bethlehem, right? Going to Bethlehem, his parents going to Bethlehem for the census, and then he's born there, but grows up in Nazareth. Yeah.
Okay. I did miss one. Tomic, I had to go look. I can't pull it up on the screen, but he asks, Tomic Eldritch, thank you for the super chat. He asked, do you think the author of Luke Acts wrote any other works?
There was a hypothesis that the pastoral epistles were written by the author of Luke Acts, because there are many similarities in the idea of the church structure at the time, and also in language, and in outlook as well. Sort of a desire to order everything and control it. So yeah, there has been a hypothesis like that. I have no reason to think he wrote other works. No, but yeah, could be.
Yeah, I mean, he really well written. So I can't imagine he didn't write other things, but are they relevant? Who knows? You know, it's just it's a fun question. Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna get down here to the nitty gritty of my own personal, because I had to take care of everyone else real quick. Maybe it's some of this stuff might be parallelomania. So I jotted down notes, and I saw some of the comments which gave me ideas too. Judas the betrayer, Judas Galilean. Is that an overstretch to try and act like there's some pattern here? Because I personally think mimesis makes better sense. Judah was the brother who sold Joseph. If you were looking at it mimetically.
So the Hebrew name, Yehuda, was it's one of the, I think, 5, maybe even 3 most common names of the period, because of Judah Maccabee, because of the Hasmoneans. And so all of the Hasmonean names of the brothers became, that was the period when, after many centuries of foreign domination, for a brief period, the Judeans had self-rule again. And it was a time of great pride, still is, Maccabi beer, Maccabi football team in Israel today, they're all named after the Hasmoneans, even today, right? So, I mean, it's a big source of pride. So Judah was just a very, very popular name, and or Judas in the Greek form Judas. I don't think I would try to make anything of that at all, really. I think we should mostly default to the idea that it's the guy's name. Of course, once you have the name, then you can play with it. So people can make connections with another Judas, but I'm not. I don't see a strong case to connect Judas of Galilee or the Golan in antiquities with Judas the betrayer. There's some New Testament scholars who argued that Judas the betrayer was. So here's an interesting point. Instead of Jesus being the mythologized one, Judas was the mythologized one. That he was a kind of embodiment of Judah, Judea. Judea kills Jesus, in other words. So he's like the personification of Judea. That's an interesting idea, but I don't think it really works very well, because in my view, it's the criterion of embarrassment, right? The gospel writers keep saying he was one of the 12 who betrayed Jesus, and this is potentially reflects badly on Jesus, that he chose one guy who would betray him. So I think it's hard to explain that way.
Now, a quick question on that before I ask a further question. Does Paul mention that there was that one of the 12 betrayed him?
Yeah, well, in 1 Corinthians 11, I was going to mention this before when you said that Paul doesn't say anything about the life of Jesus.
Right.
Actually, 1 Corinthians has a few remarks about the life of Jesus.
It just lacks a lot of data. That's the problem that they're using as evidence. But anyway, yeah, sorry.
Sure, but it's not relevant for Paul. For Paul, Jesus is the returning Savior. But in that regard, it is surprising that he says so much about Jesus' life, actually, in 1 Corinthians. And there, on the night on which he was betrayed, took bread and broke it. So that's the earliest account of the Last Supper in 1 Corinthians, right? Long before the Gospels were written, actually.
Interesting. Okay. So this begs the question then, since Judas the Galilean makes a show on Josephus's text where Josephus has to mention him, do you think, because what historians think the death of Jesus was for, cleansing the temple, do you think that he saw Judas the Galilean as a more, you know what, this figure's worth mentioning as someone who's doing this? He's cleansing the temple as well, it seems. But Jesus gets crucified and killed for the same type of deed, but gets no mention about this, and is kind of potentially seen in a positive light. If you look at the passage where him and James are brothers, or, the son of Damonus in that area, and not the Testimonium Flavianum that's been partially or wholly interpolated. Either way you put it, it's some type of interpolation, it seems. So the question is, why doesn't Josephus mention him as this deed? And yet, wouldn't he have been a bad guy too if that's what he actually did to Josephus? I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
I have to rewind what you you packed a lot in there.
I know.
Sorry. Are you saying about the Jesus passage, the Testimonium Flavianum?
So I'm just wondering why Josephus, if he has a negative look of Judas and Theudas and the Egyptian for their rebellious acts, they're people who are, and here's Jesus, the historians are saying this guy actually went to cleanse the temple. Sounds kind of rebellious. He doesn't have a negative thing to say about Jesus? Or do you think there's a partial interpolation that's covering up a negative potential mention and reference of Jesus
in the Testimonium?
What are your thoughts on that? It's speculation, but
I tried to say in the presentation a little bit that Josephus doesn't take a harsh line about everybody who's popular, or insightful. So, or is a crank even, it might be considered a crank. So his own teacher Banus, like for example, and then several of these Essene teachers who gather large audiences in Jerusalem, and they are countercultural people. So they They are not on board with King Herod, for example, but he honors them. Herod honors them, and Josephus honors them as being straight shooters who really are pious, who really are in touch with God, who really do have insight into the future. So it's and I take the John the Baptist passage. We had a session on this. I take it to be an authentic passage of Josephus, and in this passage, he treats John the Baptist very, very well, because Herod Antipas, who is the problem there, is the really bad guy. He's the guy who's unjust, and he's using John as a counterweight, a polemical contrast. So John's a very virtuous guy who teaches piety toward God, justice towards one's fellows, and Herod Antipas is the opposite of that. He's a bad, evil, destructive man, and he even killed this innocent fellow. So it's not the case that everybody who has a large following is therefore bad in Josephus's books. It depends on the context, and in the context with Jesus is that he's talking about disturbances under Pontius Pilate, and his picture of Pilate in the antiquities, more than in the war, is a very negative one. He says that Pilate wanted to overturn Judean law. So when he brought the standards into Jerusalem, that was a deliberate attempt to violate Judean law in antiquities. And it's in that context that he brings up the Jesus passage. So Pilate executed this man who was a fine teacher of people.
So you would say it's partially interpolated, right?
Or uninterpolated. That is, Alice
misunderstood.
Alice Whaley wrote a very fine scholarly study of the history of the Testimonium Flavianum, and she argued that the very simplest explanation is not that anything's interpolated, but that something's left out. That Josephus initially said something like he was believed to be the Messiah, or he was called Christos by his followers or something, and that just dropped out, and so it's left with he was Christos. And that has a lot in its favor, because Jerome later on, and then this Arab Christian source later in the 10th century or so also cite that version. They say that Josephus wrote that he was believed to be, or was thought to be by his followers, the Messiah, not that he was the Messiah. So it's quite possible that what the scribes did was they just dropped that out.
I thought that the other passage with James and Jesus, it says Jesus called the Messiah or something was there, or called the Christ or something was in that other. Yeah. So I wonder if they're lifting it from there rather than Testimonium. I don't know. I mean, there's so many ways to chop it up. But
no, that's also a reason why you might think that that's what he wrote in the Jesus passage.
Okay.
Because he writes it in the James passage. He says there he was the one called, not that he was the Christ, but he was known as he was the Jesus, very common name, as you said, but he was the Jesus who was nicknamed the Christ. If he that's what he says in the James passage. If he'd also said that in the Jesus passage, that would make quite decent sense.
I think we should pick apart this one day, like go in depth into this in your research, and like how you've picked up from other scholars and stuff, and just kind of pick this, because there's too much in this to actually just leave this alone. Eusebius, there's a theory that he's the one who put it all in here because it sounds similar to his language. I'd love to have you maybe do a close examination of this particular topic, if that'd be okay with you.
Well, sure. Yeah, I've done it before, but yeah, I could do it again. Be happy to.
My audience would love to hear your particular. I can guarantee you that. Couple super chats. I'm going to shut up. I've got the beheading of Theudas, and then John the Baptist is beheaded. I've heard people try to make some type of connections here, but then you also have mimesis from Dennis MacDonald, who suggests this beheading is also something we find in the Odyssey. And there seems to be, it's at a party. There's promiscuous situation taking place at a party in the Odyssey where a wife cheats on the husband. Here you have Herod. This woman is being promiscuous, dancing and whatnot. What do you want, woman? You shook it just right. Okay, I want the head of that guy. Okay, cool. Well, there seems mimetic potential connections here, but I don't even look. It's not about me. It's about you guys. So let's go with them. We have plenty of time. I mean, I'm telling you, you can never not have something to talk about on the show. You're just wonderful. So, Mr. Evac, thank you for the super chat. Is there a good reason to believe Luke Acts was written by Luke, the companion of Paul? Which I think we've already erased that out of the picture. But anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is there credibility to this tradition, and why doesn't Luke himself in the preface? So why doesn't he mention?
Why doesn't Luke name himself in the preface? Yeah, I think that's what was meant. Yeah, exactly. Well, all the Gospels are anonymous, of course. They're all, which is a curious thing, but it is more curious in the case of Luke because that author follows the conventions. He's the only one who has a prologue that looks like a historical prologue, and normally a historian wants to put himself forward and say, I, Josephus, or I, Diodorus, or I, Dionysius, I have followed everything. He's really putting himself out there. I think the answer to that question is most simply that at the end of the day, he does not present himself as a historian. So he's insinuating historical kind of stuff. He could do it if he wanted to. He knows classical literature. He knows all the forms. He's doing the jazz that you do as a historian. But he's saying, yeah, but I've got something better than history, because history is investigation to find the truth. You go and weigh stuff like I'm doing as a historian. What he's saying is, no, we got the truth already. We don't need history. And I would suggest that could be the reason why he doesn't name himself, because he's not trying to be a historian. He's not trying to put himself over that way. He's trying to say, hey, Christ came, rose from the dead. That's the crucial thing. The whole of Luke Acts is moving toward the death and resurrection of Christ, then moving away from it as the pivot of the 2-volume work, right? In Jerusalem, the resurrection of Christ. That's the thing, the appointment of the apostles to go out. They've seen the sure proof. He uses all this language of sure proof, tekmerion, this a Greek term for certain proof of the resurrection of Christ. They have seen it. It's for sure. They know it. It's true. And then they go out and proclaim it. That's not history. All right. He's not saying, might have happened, might not have happened. We need to weigh the evidence. No. That's not Luke Acts' thing. He's saying we have the truth, and it's this, and that's why the apostles speak freely, boldly to everybody, because they have the truth. So, in my view, he's making very clear that he could do history if he wanted to, but hey, he's got something far better than history to deal with here. He's got the truth to proclaim. So this would mean suppressing his own identity, and leaving it between the lines, because it's not about him. It's about the truth. That's the one side of the question. The other side is then, is it plausible that he is the guy that Paul refers to in Colossians, Luke the physician? I don't think so. This old idea is not in the text itself. It was an idea of the early church fathers, and then it was revived also in modern scholarship when people noticed that he uses quite precise medical terms. So Paul had mentioned a guy called Luke the physician, and then you've got this guy using, like, when people are healed and he describes their ankles or whatever, he's using quite precise sort of anatomical terminology. The problem is with that he also uses really precise sailing terminology in Acts 27 when he's talking about the sailboats and the rigging and the ropes and the different kind of sails and things like that. So you could say by the same token, he's a sailor, you know. The point is the guy's smart, and he's trying to tell you he knows the proper terminology. So he knows about the census under Quirinius. You know, he knows all this stuff because he's very smart. But he's not trying to put himself forward as a historian. So I think that the idea that he's that Luke, the physician, the companion of Paul, there's no reason to believe that actually from the text. And if it's dated after 95, then it's not really in the cards.
Yeah, it's more about foundational tradition and what you particularly believe about inerrancy. All of that stuff plays a significant role, or that usually plays a significant role in modern Christians that I've talked to. But Zachary Sorensen, thank you for this question. Josephus mentions Judas of Sepphoris, 4 BC, Judas of Gamala, 680, as both Judas of Galilee. Are they the same or different?
Yeah, that's an interesting. That's a really learned question, actually. Some scholars have identified the two. I think there's no reason to identify them, again, because Judas is a common name. It's really one of the most common names. So that's the only thing they have in common, actually. How the Judas of Gamla is only in, he's Judas of the Golan, and Gamla is in the Golan. In antiquities, he's Judas of Galilee in war too. I think that if he were the other guy, of the guy mentioned in Sepphoris in 4 BCE, I think Josephus has such a strong interest in making the other Judas a patriarch of all the rebels. I think he would have made that connection too, but he doesn't. So I don't think there's simply no reason to make the connection except the name. And the name is not material. It's so common.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean he couldn't be the same guy, but it's just to shift him around from Sepphoris to, and what he's described as doing in Sepphoris, it doesn't really fit with his activity in Jerusalem later, this guy from the Golan. So I just don't see the reason to connect them all.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we just there's so many interesting things to get into. I really do appreciate you for having church with me on Sunday. This was a fantastic show. Guys, we were almost at 4 hours in recording today. This was absolutely amazing. There are so many little clips that you could go and just kind of lift and see. That was really interesting how you answered that, Dr. Mason. So I really appreciate the way that you approach all of these topics. You're delicate in the way that you're responding to people, even if you're critical about how you view that particular thing. We love you here, and we want you to always come back. So
thank you very much, Derek. Hey, it's always really a great privilege for me to do this. As we discussed before, you know, it's just like meeting so many people. I don't actually meet you, but being able to share these ideas with so many interested people who want to be there. You know,
yeah.
It's fantastic. It's a thrill. It's a gas. So thank you.
Well, imagine this, right? There's 300 and if you count my Facebook combined with my YouTube, 350 people still watching this right now after almost 4 hours, right?
That's crazy.
Some leave, some come back, right? Some just showed up, but it's pretty steady. Think about that. And that's a really, really interesting thing. That's how many people are interested in the topics. I was telling people someone needs to inform all of these publishers to stop taking academic works and throwing these numbers, these outrageous prices on them, because that's how many people, like just on this channel, and there's many of these countless channels on the YouTube, they're just not marketing this stuff right. They're really not. They don't know how to present this so that people who are out there who are actually interested in this stuff will go, hey, you know what? I want a copy of that. But now they got to go pay $110, $200 for a book that would have cost $30, $25. You know, they could make a huge profit, but it's ridiculous. The prices they're hitting people over the head with, in my opinion. And anyway, we're trying to make a change. You're helping with that. And I love the PowerPoints too. The things you bring, the presentation, we get a view into the mind of a historian and seeing how you're viewing these things. So
My pleasure.
thank you. Go eat
Always.
dinner. I'm sure you're hungry.
I am a bit hungry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we chat for a minute after this?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, love you. I'm not even doing an outro. This has been too long. I'm just going to let you know we are MythVision, and Dr. Mason will be back.
Thank you.
Thank you.